The Earth Alliance is one of the youngest spacefaring nations in the known galaxy, yet they are also one of the largest and most influential. 100 years ago, humanity was on the verge of destroying itself in a global civil war when first contact was made with intelligent alien life. Since then, man has spread throughout local space to occupy more than a dozen additional systems, fought and won 2 major wars and several smaller ones, and established diplomatic connections with virtually every race within 100 light-years. One of humanity's primary assets is the overall adaptability and curiosity of its people. Humans love to explore, and the instant they got their hands on hyperspace technology, deep survey missions were being sent to every corner of the galaxy. Humans also appreciate freedom, and eagerly flock to new colony sites in search of new opportunities. A generally friendly race, they had little trouble meeting aliens and trading with them, in the process quickly advancing their level of technology up to a level where they could safely defend themselves from aggressive neighbors. Humans are many things. Diplomats, traders, farmers, designers, doctors, explorers, and much more. They are the ones who can do it all. Yet, despite their apparent friendliness and curiosity, they are a race fraught with internal problems. All too often their natural aggressiveness turns inward upon itself. Religious and ethnic groups are still at odds with each other despite centuries of alliance. Good-natured competition between nation-states and colonies all too often turns sour. The government, stable on the surface, internally struggles for control over increasingly independent-minded planet. Telepaths and mundanes remain constantly at odds, separated by genetics and decades of dichotomy. The human race may appear strong and confident from the outside, but internally, they are still struggling to find a measure of stability with themselves. We will detail the Earth Alliance in its entirety. From the homeworld of Earth to the colonies of Mars, Proxima, Orion, and more, every part of the Alliance. The middle years of the 21st century saw a world in constant turmoil. Wars of varying intensity were commonplace, and terrorism became the primary tool for those nations or organizations not large enough to challenge their rivals through military force. The United Nations, which should have risen to the forefront of stability, proved not only unable to exert any influence, but to even determine what its own role should be. As a result, its power, if, indeed, it ever actually had any, was mostly ineffectual. What the globe truly needed was a unifying force with the will to police the planet. Sadly, it took an event of truly world-shattering importance to finally bring about the necessary changes. In 2080, growing tensions between India and Pakistan finally flared into war. While India possessed a higher population and greater resources than their smaller neighbor, the Pakistanis were better prepared and made significant advances during the opening clashes of the war. However, the front quickly stabilized and all hopes for a swift resolution began to wane, forcing both countries to call upon their allies for support. The United Nations once again proved unable to exert any influence of significance, and provided little more than a central location where diplomats could spout rhetoric and argue with each other. At the end of the first year, no less than 12 different nations were involved in the hostilities in one form or another. Pakistan was at the forefront of a powerful trade alliance between many of the former Russian states that earned independence after the breakup of the Soviet Union in the late 20th century. Without exception, these countries, Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Azerbaijan, and Armenia, with the notable exception of Georgia, began to send troops and equipment into Pakistan to replace losses that nation's industry could not quickly construct. While individually their military power was limited, they proved quite effective when united. In response, India called upon its friends in Bangladesh and Nepal to join the fight, and began to put pressure on the Chinese to intervene. China had no great desire to get involved in the conflict. Their economy was stretched to its limit with the task of supporting its nation's swollen population of over 3 billion citizens, many of whom were growing increasingly dissatisfied with their way of life. The vast majority of China's people were, effectively, peasants who watched from poverty while the rest of the world lived in ever-increasing health and comfort, particularly in the United States, European Union, and most infuriatingly, India. However, China's economy depended entirely upon trade with those very nations they looked upon with a jealous eye. Without the steady flow of outgoing goods that provided the foreign currency needed to support its internal expenses, China would quickly slip to the brink of collapse. The United Nations urged China not to get involved, and indeed, the government in Beijing knew full well they could not afford it, but in the end several factors convinced them to fight. First and foremost, they could not let India lose, or the interruption of trade would weaken their economy to the point of no return. Secondly, the promise of victory would provide a morale boost to China's population and allow for further suppression of dissenters among the citizenry. Anyone who complained would be labeled a traitor and eliminated. Finally, a quick success in the conflict would give China the opportunity to seize some of the assets of the defeated enemy, as well as drain Pakistan's treasury to pay for any war reparations. In fact, if things went perfectly, China might even annex certain resource-rich areas of territory as spoils of war. The United Nations might complain, but what could they do? To this end, China began pouring troops across the Pakistani border in early 2082. Pakistan had no chance to stop these advancing armies. If they pulled troops away from the Indian front, that line would shatter and all would be lost. In desperation, and indeed with no other choice available to them, Pakistani aircraft dropped 3 low-yield nuclear bombs atop the advancing Chinese spearheads, utterly annihilating them. Reaction from the world was one of immediate outrage and panic. Global stock markets collapsed overnight as the threat of nuclear annihilation loomed. Fearing further strikes on Chinese territory, the government in Beijing ordered the launch of 12 nuclear missiles into Pakistan, but these never reached their targets. Instead, all of them mysteriously exploded at the highest point of their ballistic trajectory. A second strike also failed, as did a counterattack by Pakistan's few existing ballistic missiles. Although long-range attacks were somehow rendered impotent, cruise missiles and tactical artillery shells were successfully exchanged, leaving the border between Pakistan and China a devastated wasteland. Limited nuke strikes also occurred within India itself, on or near the front lines, but both sides resisted the temptation to start destroying each other's cities. Within the United Nations, the use of nuclear weapons by the warring powers was the object of heated debate. The Security Council produced a resolution condemning further use of such weapons, but this was summarily ignored. In response, the United States, Britain, and Russia unilaterally cut off all trade and financial support to the entire area. China's government collapsed within days, and its people exploded into a long, smoldering revolution. With no central command left to guide China's vast armies, each field commander took the opportunity to proceed as they felt necessary to suppress the revolt. The resulting civil war was incredibly bloody, and several parts of China broke into separate nations that would not be reunited for decades, or, in the case of Taiwan, over a century. What remained of the Chinese military blamed the UN, and particularly Russia, for the disaster, which, for all intents and purposes, was probably inevitable anyway. The generals commanding China's remaining forces came together in mid-2082 and agreed, after examining intelligence reports gathered from dubious sources, that Russia had set the whole thing up as a prelude to invasion. Thus, in a move that totally surprised nearly everyone, Chinese forces began streaming across the broad Russian border, capturing everything they could and destroying whatever they could not hold. Once again, intercontinental nuclear missiles were launched, but not a single one ever struck any target. It was at this point that the United States revealed a previously unknown array of automated global defense satellites capable of tracking and knocking down any ballistic missile within minutes of launch. This system, known as Earthshield, put the United Nations into an uproar. Every country, with the exception of Britain and Australia, argued bitterly. It was their contention that the use of such a system against active military forces was an act of war. America argued that had they not utilized Earthshield, most of Pakistan, India and China, if not the whole of Asia, would be a devastated zone of radioactive slag. In response, Russia and China withdrew from the United Nations, effectively causing that organization to cease to exist. Over the course of the ensuing year, the ongoing war spread throughout Asia. Chinese armies rampaged through eastern Russia, but stalled as they approached Moscow. The winter of that year, heightened by nuclear-driven dust in the upper atmosphere, was one of the worst on record. Millions of Chinese and Russians died on the steppe. Korea, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia all became involved in the fighting to one degree or another. The United States and European Union, suffering economically under the collapse of the world's stock markets, sent in troops to try to halt the fighting, but were fired upon by the very people they were trying to help. In the end, the military might of the two superpowers remained idle, waiting in offshore task forces or within neutral countries for the fighting to die down. World War III, as it was now becoming known, did not officially end until 2084, although scattered fighting continued between India and Pakistan until the middle of 2085. Much of the region was devastated or entirely destroyed. The world markets gradually stabilized as China's armies retreated and resumed the goal of suppressing the revolution. Most of Pakistan's allies, their resources depleted by punishing Indian airstrikes, pulled out of the war one by one. India eventually drove Pakistan back to its own border, but made no effort to advance further, fearing additional nuclear bombardment or, more likely, intervention by the United States, which was by then threatening to begin bombing both sides if the war did not come to an immediate halt. When all was said and done, very few borders changed, but over a dozen nations were left in ruins. The world would never be the same. Very few people on the face of the earth escaped World War III without some direct effect on their way of life. The nations involved in the fighting were but shadows of their former selves. Estimates suggested China alone lost well over 100 million people during the bloody fighting, not to mention those who perished in the epidemics and starvation that followed, or in the terrible winter of 2084. Over half of India's territory was a smoking ruin, as was a large swath of northern Pakistan. Inflation was rampant, with the value of the euro and American dollar dropping by as much as 50% during the last 3 years of the war. Worse still were the lingering bad feelings left by the intervention of American satellites in preventing the devastating nuclear exchange that would have likely swept India and Pakistan off the face of the planet. The Yanks, Brits and Aussies could only shake their heads as angry nations complained that the lack of a ballistic missile threat led directly to China's collapse and the subsequent invasion of Russia. Plus, the argument went on, the existence of such a system presented a direct threat to freedom the world over. After all, if a missile could be destroyed in flight, why not just about anything else? Could an orbiting laser not be turned upon an aircraft in flight, or a factory, or an entire city? Things seemed bleak. Russia and China refused to rejoin the United Nations as long as the Earthshield satellites remained in place. In response, the United States argued that the day of the United Nations was over. That body had time and time again proven itself ineffective in its role. What was needed was nothing less than a unified global military both willing and able to do what was necessary to preserve peace. In a move that surprised everyone, including the American people, the United States government offered Earthshield, and the American military itself, as the core of what they called the Unified Earth Force. This was the very genesis of the combined arms establishment that would one day be known simply as Earth Force. Under the broad and visionary, if overly ambitious American plan, a new organization would be created that would, at some distant point in the future, evolve into the first truly global government the world had ever seen. Obviously, this would not happen overnight, but over the course of many years, if not decades. No one was naive enough to believe the world could be united swiftly, and many felt it would simply never happen at all. However, considering not only the present state of Asia, but also the economic effect the war had on the rest of the world, some argued that national economies were already so intertwined that a world government was already necessary to ensure effective management of resources and trade. Initially, there was much resistance to the unified Earth proposal. Russia and China in particular insisted the United States was doing little more than uniting the world under its own banner. Few nations wanted to become just another star floating with hundreds of others above the red and white stripes that lined the Yankee flag.
Yankees.
Many of these countries insisted that the threat of the Earth Shield weaponry was a hammer waiting to descend upon them should they refuse to join the proposed alliance. However, not everyone was so eager to complain. Britain and most of Europe readily backed the plan, immediately grasping the benefits of open trade and unified defense. Many of the poorer nations, such as those in Africa and South America, also agreed, primarily as a means to aid their own economies, which had fallen along with the world markets during the war. Throughout the late 2080s, the Unified Earth Alliance gradually took shape and became known as simply the Earth Alliance. In 2087, the organization was officially formed at a special conference in Geneva, Switzerland, later to become the official alliance capital. All of North and South America, most of Europe and Africa, Israel, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, and a smattering of minor Asian and Pacific Rim nations were initial signers of the alliance charter. Notable holdouts included Russia, China, India, Pakistan, France, Egypt, Libya, North Korea, Vietnam, and the whole of the Middle East except Israel. All nations were invited to join, and, for the moment, no sanctions were put forth against those who remained independent. As time passed, the Earth Alliance quickly grew in power and influence. The borders between its member nations began to blur as they took on the aspect of states within a confederation instead of independent countries. A single currency, the credit, was created in 2095, sending dollars, pounds, euros, and the like by the wayside. Although the individual nations would continue to retain their own standing armies for decades, the core of Earth Force was formed in 2091 and grew steadily thereafter. This multinational force standardized on English as its primary language and operated equipment primarily provided by the United States and European Union. As trust continued to build, member nations began to share secrets with each other, resulting in a significant burst of technological advancement. New and cheaper ways to reach and explore space were discovered and put to use, resulting in the creations of permanent space stations and bases on the Moon and, later, Mars. These provided stepping stones to the outer planets and resource-rich asteroids, and the promulgation of jobs and industry created a kind of golden age within those nations that made up the Earth Alliance. But there were still some countries holding out, and it would take both political and military force to finally bring them into the fold. From outside the increasingly affluent alliance, the holdout nations looked on with growing disdain, jealousy, and greed. Resisting this growing power became more and more difficult. For some countries, like Russia and China, staying out of the Earth Alliance was a matter of national pride. For others, such as North Korea and France, it was their strong independent nature. Still other nations, including India, Pakistan, and the Middle East, felt the organization was too firmly rooted in Christianity to join. Most of these countries continued to remain apart from the alliance through much of the 2090s, although Egypt and Libya entered the fold in 2093, and an increasingly isolated France finally gave in on January 1, 2096. Each of these countries was welcomed with open arms, and although the first couple of years were difficult while integration proceeded, they soon began to enjoy the same prosperity as the rest of the Earth Alliance. Seeing this, a number of smaller holdouts joined as the century came to a close, with only China, Russia, India, Pakistan, the nations of the Middle East remaining outside the envelope. In an attempt to resist what they saw as an increasing threat of annexation, Saudi Arabia attempted to organize its Muslim neighbors into the League of Palestinian Nations, but could not convince the others to accept any form of unified government that would result in the slightest reduction in sovereignty. A similar attempt by Russia to produce an alliance with the Asian holdouts failed utterly due to long-standing antipathies between all four nations. In response to these unification attempts, the alliance began to put pressure on the remaining countries to get their heads out of the sand and finally become part of the world community. Many within the alliance saw these holdouts as a significant threat to world peace. A rearmed India and Pakistan were beginning to hiss at each other again, while Russia and China had turned their own border into 1,000 miles of razor wire, mines, and gun emplacements waiting to fire at the slightest provocation. Worse still, the Middle East was fully involved in a terror campaign designed to undermine the alliance and break up its members, particularly their ancient foe Israel. Unlike the United Nations, however, the Earth Alliance had the power to enforce its will and the willingness to use that power. At first it began to influence the holdout countries by the skillful use of propaganda. Russia was seen by alliance leaders as the key to all the others, so a campaign began to sway the Russian government and people to join the EA of their own accord. The benefits of membership were extolled in public displays and on-air broadcast advertising, focusing primarily on the economic advantages of unlimited trade with Europe and America. Even more important, though, was the promise of defiance against the Chinese threat. No longer would Russia be required to hold the border on their own. Should China invade, the entire Earth Alliance would come to their aid. In the end, Russia swallowed its pride and agreed to join the Earth Alliance at the start of 2101. As soon as that announcement was made, China, convinced that Russia would rearm with Earth Alliance technology and then crush their longtime rivals once and for all, chose to jump the gun and launched an immediate invasion. The alliance responded by declaring Russia a protected state and opened fire with advanced satellite weaponry, long-range aircraft, and other assets of a technological level well beyond anything the Chinese could deploy. The war lasted only 5 days before the devastated Chinese armies retreated. However, when Russia pressed to counterattack, the alliance ordered them to stand down their forces, which they did immediately. Shortly after the 5-day war, China's government underwent a dramatic change. Virtually overnight, they began to put out feelers to the alliance. The sting of their defeat was replaced with a burning desire not to let their Russian enemies enter into any arrangement that left the proud Chinese on the outside looking in. Ultimately, both Russia and China officially joined the alliance simultaneously on the 1st of January 2101, although they continued to guard their mutual border for years afterward, and neither truly trusted each other for decades. Pakistan and India also took the hint and joined simultaneously, surprisingly without conflict, in 2102. The Middle East proved a more difficult nut to crack. Each country there had become a sort of island unto itself, and each operated terrorists against nearly every country in the alliance. The problem finally came to a head when a small nuclear weapon was employed against Israel in 2105. The explosion was traced to a terrorist organization operating out of Iran. The Earth Alliance was outraged. Something had to be done, but the outright use of military force was deemed unacceptable. The Alliance did not feel that using force against Iran would solve the problem, only exacerbate it, as occurred during the War on Terrorism a century earlier. Instead, they responded by sealing off the entire Middle East from the rest of the world, isolating them as no other nations had ever been isolated before. All land routes were closed, and all sea lanes were patrolled by a military blockade. Ships leaving the harbors were captured and interned with minimal use of force, while any citizens caught were simply returned to their home countries. Initially, terrorism continued unabated, but over time the alliance finally managed to put an end to the threat. The trapped countries responded as if they were under siege, occasionally running suicide bombers out to attack guards, or firing missiles and artillery at their neighbors. The Alliance responded by gradually destroying anything that could be used as a weapon. Even this would not be enough to convince the besieged nations, so with no other options available, the Alliance decided to invade each country in turn. As Earth Alliance forces crossed the border, the greater portion of the people flocked to them as liberators, happy to be rid of their oppressive leaders. The era of independent nations had finally come to an end, and while it didn't happen the way the Alliance founders hoped it would, Earth was at last unified under a single government. Although all seemed to be going well for Earth, this was not entirely the case. Not every nation appreciated the way the Alliance conducted its affairs. The old nationalities were difficult to forget, after all. For every decision made that benefited one area or region, someone else felt slighted, or grew jealous of someone else's perceived prosperity. Nowhere was this more apparent than in the Alliance's early forays into space. The United States and European Union had pursued space programs long before the formation of the Earth Alliance, and thus were naturally far ahead of all other countries. The Russian and Chinese programs were woefully behind following World War III, while no one else had the technology base to put anything significant into orbit. Worse still, the Alliance made a far-sighted error in continuing to operate their space exploration efforts from within America and Europe instead of expanding into other nation-states. As a result, the work performed in colonizing the Moon and Mars became seen as a matter of American and European pride instead of something the entire Earth Alliance could share. As the Alliance moved gradually into space, civilian investments naturally followed. Eventually, companies and wealthy individuals began to expand to the asteroids and outer planets, looking for mining opportunities. The solar system proved to be a vast storehouse of wealth just waiting to be tapped, but only those with the proper technological backing could get to them. Eventually, some of the less scrupulous nations, as well as certain organizations just beginning to grow in power, discovered it was cheaper and easier to seize the profits of others instead of earning them honestly. This was the origin of the very first raiders, who began by lurking near established shipping lanes, but eventually moved on to scouring the asteroids and terrorizing any honest miner they encountered. In response to this, the ever-growing population of corporate miners demanded action. While some of these raiders were independent, the vast majority were funded and backed by greedy nations or those who felt slighted by the greater influence of America and Europe. Unwilling to risk enraging those states by direct action, and lacking any sort of non-orbital space-based military funding, the Earth Alliance sat idly by and did nothing while the raiders grew in power. Frustrated, the miners, now referring to themselves as Belters despite the fact that not all of them operated in the traditional Martian-Jovian asteroid belt, began arming their ships and fighting back. This resulted in an arms race and the development of the first organized raider band. To counter this, the miners created the Belt Alliance, a group of like-minded Belters dedicated to defending its members against piracy in all forms. By the mid-2120s, this new organization became quite formal, requiring membership by all Belters and operating under a code of honor that required all miners to answer distress calls from fellow prospectors. The old tradition of staking a claim and then earning all the wealth that Strike offered was discarded in favor of a group-sharing program with bonuses for those who worked harder and found new opportunities. In many ways, the Belt Alliance became a union that shared its profits and provided for its own defense. It was on its way to becoming the first privately owned military force in space, even going so far as to construct its own fighters. These simple, one-man craft, the precursor to what would one day become the hardy and inexpensive Delta V, were attached externally to Belter ships where they could quickly be deployed against any raider vessel that threatened them. In response, of course, the raiders quickly developed or bought fighters of their own, and soon both sides escalated to attack vessels and warship. The Belt Alliance, often referred to as the BA, is a product of the same stresses that created Earthforce. The two organizations are often thought of as half-brothers, although in fact, one has a strictly military purpose while the other does not. Where Earthforce is concerned with defending the Earth Alliance and all its interests, the Belt Alliance exists solely as a means to support civilian and corporate shipping. Indeed, the Belt Alliance had its very origins in the corporate sphere. Once the asteroid belt was opened up to civilian prospectors in the early 2100s, various rival corporations sent teams out to secure the largest and most valuable asteroids, Ceres, Vesta, Pallas, Juno, and many others discovered centuries before by telescope. Some of these huge rocks were as much a kilometer across, though most were far smaller. Once a suitable target was claimed, the corporation set up a mining outpost, using Martian industrial colonies as a base of operations and as clients. While most of the larger asteroids were quickly taken by corporations, thousands of smaller ones remained, and not just in the belt between Mars and Jupiter. The solar system literally swarms with chunks of debris and cometary material left over from countless millennia ago, and it was this that independent belters sought out with abandon. Many of these early prospectors became quite wealthy, and in much the same way as the gold rush of the 1840s drew hordes of miners to California, the outer solar system was soon inundated by would-be belters. Sadly, as the number of viable asteroids rapidly declined and the possibility of instant wealth dwindled to a memory, many of these poverty-stricken prospectors turned to piracy. The Belt Alliance originated as a consortium of private companies who agreed to share resources and arm their ships against the growing organization of raiders in the outer system. As raiders became more and more sophisticated and the size of their cartels grew, the Belt Alliance stepped up its own development, eventually expanding to the point where it achieved independence from any one group of corporations. By now it was more like a union, using dues and membership fees to finance the addition of weapons to otherwise unarmed freighters and mining craft. In addition, mercenary pilots rushed to join the newly created fighter corps, eager to see action and make a name for themselves. By 2126, the Belt Alliance was large and strong enough to apply for legal corporate status, which was granted. Now legalized and legitimate, they attracted tremendous business to themselves and to Mars, where factories now turned out space fighters by the dozens. Even this, though, was unable to stem the tide of raider activity, which threatened to expand out of control. What few knew was that many of the companies on Mars that produced and sold arms for belter use were simultaneously arming raiders on the side, turning a tidy profit by acting as middlemen for both. They were, in fact, putting on their own war, all in the name of money. Sadly, this fact did not come to light for many years. In the meantime, incidents began to mount, and raiders became bolder. In 2129, they attacked and seriously damaged a large mining station on Ceres, killing half the workers there and making off with almost 6 months' worth of processed ore. Early in 2130, a veritable horde of raiders descended upon a well-defended corporate outpost near Saturn's moon Triton, resulting in the first serious space battle in the history of the solar system. Although the raiders were defeated, the loss of life was tremendous. Other incidents occurred, and while few were nearly as spectacular, the media on Earth and Mars turned them into spectacles. Vids of floating debris following raider attacks, especially those with flash-frozen corpses among the wreckage, were particularly enticing. A groundswell of public opinion encouraged the Earth Alliance to create Earthforce to help police the system and drive out the raiders. Initial encounters between Earth and Belter forces were less than auspicious, but soon the Belt Alliance learned to just keep out of Earthforce's sway. The power of the pirates was soon broken, and once the major cartels were defeated, Earthforce began to root out their suppliers. The trail led back to Mars, but of course by then most of the profiteers had departed with their ill-gotten gains. Soon other races learned of the Belt Alliance and began to hire them for escort work into or near Earth space. The Belt Alliance accepted these jobs so long as they did not come into conflict with Earth Force. Clearly, it would not do to ship into enemy space during wartime, for example. Again, the leadership of the Belt Alliance went out of their way to ensure they operated wholly within the domain of their own charter, thereby ensuring good relations with Earth and the highest possible profit margin at all times. In addition to working with alien races, the Belt Alliance soon began to hire alien citizens as well. Soon, Drazi, Brakiri, Narns, Centauri, Pakmare, and others could be found within the ranks of the Belt Alliance, usually operating on cargo runs or escort duty within their own territory. This, as much as diplomatic efforts, went a long way towards establishing humanity as one of the newer and friendlier powers within the galaxy. The Belt Alliance attempted to stay out of the combat zones during the Dilger War, although some ships were lost in territory the Dilger invaded without warning. After those initial attacks, the Belt Alliance ceased shipping anything remotely resembling weapons, but when the Dilger didn't stop ambushing their freighters and slaughtering their escorts, the Alliance pulled back all its forces from the affected areas. The logistics of the war itself were for the most part handled by Earth Force military transports, although some Belt Alliance units took part late in the war and in the months that followed. In the years after the invasion, Belt Alliance vessels were highly active in rebuilding the logistics network linking the League together. While this effort was greatly appreciated by most of the affected worlds, some Vree guilds felt the Belt Alliance was hurting their profits and took action. Fighting was common for several years, but ceased once the Belters convinced Earthdome to file a formal protest with the Vree government. After that, battles dropped off and were eventually dismissed as the actions of a few rogue mercenaries who happened to be flying Vree ship. Nonetheless, the Belt Alliance remains distrustful of the Vree even today. The Earth/Minbari War was where the Belt Alliance truly proved its worth. Although the Belters did not fight directly, except at the Battle of the Line, they were instrumental in rescuing thousands of refugees from doomed outposts and colonies. In addition, decades of experience with hyperspace travel in the region permitted the Belt Alliance to lead civilian transport ships away from pursuit down hyperspace paths the Minbari had yet to discover. In addition to these invaluable missions, armed Belt Alliance craft put themselves in harm's way on numerous occasions to ensure the survival of countless others, sacrificing their own crews in some of the most heroic acts to ever grace the spaceways. Even at the end, when Earth appeared doomed, the Belters did not scatter to the stars, but stood firm with Earth Force and died by the thousands. Despite these acts of selfless heroism, few Belters were given the credit they deserved after the war. In public announcements explaining the surrender, Earth Force frequently remarked on the desperate heroism shown by its own members, but almost never mentioned the Belt Alliance. This left a bitter aftertaste in the mouths of the Belter leadership, who responded by relocating their home base to the Proxima system following the war. Many Belters believe that Earth's growing tendency towards Terra-centrism and the constant treatment of colonists as second-class citizens can only lead to trouble in the future. While all this was going on, the Earth Alliance watched with growing concern. They simply could not sit idly by while open war progressed outside the atmospheres of Earth and Mars. The time had come to project their influence beyond the planets they protected. Even those nations who originally supported the raiders agreed to cooperate, for the pirates they funded were growing more and more powerful with each passing day. The unified Earth Force, until now concerned entirely with defense of Earth and its outposts, began to construct its first space navy. Known by the shortened name Earth Force, this unified military arm began operations in 2131 by patrolling the larger asteroids and the moons of Jupiter. Early on, some Belters, not quite trusting the new peacekeepers, or simply mistaking them for approaching raiders, opened fire on Earth Force vessels. Ultimately, after a brief period of mistrust and doubt, the Belt Alliance simply went back to business, happy to have someone else around to shoot down the pirate. Although Earth Force was eventually accepted and even welcomed amidst the outer planets, the Belt Alliance did not simply disarm. Earth Force police ships and fighters could not be everywhere, after all. However, the Earth Alliance could not simply allow another military force, even one as decentralized as the Belt Alliance, to exist. Such a force might eventually challenge their sovereignty. In the end, a treaty was signed prohibiting the Belt Alliance from operating anything other than light fighters and small escort craft, in exchange for greater numbers of police vessels and established military outposts where Belters could retreat if attacked. In the end, Earth Force rooted out and destroyed most of the pirate organizations currently in place in the solar system. Some did survive, primarily by becoming nomads and operating in concert with turncoat Belters who sold transit schedules on the side. Still, for the most part, peace was achieved, and a period of rapid expansion began. Yet, despite this seeming prosperity, the core of the Earth Alliance seethed with discord. But as things in the outer planets seemed to be coming under control, old problems back on Earth would start rearing their head once again. But on the brink of another world war, an event would take place that would change humanity's place in the universe forever. As the decades passed, many of the promises of the Earth Alliance Charter failed to appear. Nations that were poor remained, for the most part, poor. While the quality of life did improve significantly in those regions, it did not advance nearly as swiftly as in locations such as North America and Europe. This created a growing disparity in regions like South America, Africa, and much of Asia, who began to rumble about seceding from the alliance. In addition to this, those nations who joined by force or threat of force were not unilaterally accepted into the alliance. The distrust and bad feelings did not fade as they had when the first round of holdouts, such as France, entered the Union. India and Pakistan steadfastly refused to accept any orders to disband their militaries and, in fact, built them up at a rapid clip using funds that were supposed to go towards humanitarian aid and infrastructure. Similarly, China and Russia took the influx of alliance technology and secretly built larger and more effective armed forces, including many outlawed weapons of mass destruction. These weapons included ground-based anti-satellite systems capable of tracking and knocking out the Earth Shield defense network, theoretically providing a first strike capability over their rival but, in fact, merely ensuring mutual destruction should war come to pass. For a while, it did seem like war was inevitable. China's population remained among the poorest in the world and blamed the alliance for all its problems. Russia continually chafed at the way their scientific and technological programs were hamstrung by deployment restrictions. The fact that they were using those very advancements to build up their military in direct violation of the Alliance Charter did not stop either from protesting or the continuation of the illegal activities. In addition to the difficulties with the larger nations, many smaller ones felt they were even worse off. The countries that were forced to join against their will, in particular those that made up the Palestinian states, were particularly incensed by the way they were being treated. Underground leaders continued to operate terrorist cells throughout the world, surviving despite all attempts by security forces to eliminate them. One of these finally succeeded in doing the one thing the Earth Alliance feared most. They acquired a nuclear bomb and used it in 2150 to destroy San Diego. The response was immediate. The government declared the equivalent of martial law until those responsible were caught, significantly reducing freedoms worldwide. Although the terrorists responsible for the devastation on America's west coast were eventually caught and most restrictions lifted, many people felt the alliance acted too strongly. Some believed the leaders at Earth Dome had too much power and that the Earth Alliance's influence had to be curtailed. Rumblings of rebellion began to appear across the globe, even in places where such things would have been unconscionable a few decades earlier. By the mid-2150s, Russia and China each had a military strength in excess of the Earth Alliance itself, and both sides were operating their own space forces as well. China secretly signed deals with Korea and India to aid them in any coming conflict, and in response, Russia and Pakistan formed their own alliance. paramilitary groups began to form throughout the region on one side or the other, with the Middle Eastern nations joining in wherever possible. South America and Africa continued to threaten secession, and the Earth Alliance teetered on the brink of total collapse. As the world prepared for the end, something unexpected happened. On April 7, 2155, a Centauri survey vessel dropped out of hyperspace near Jupiter and made first contact with the human race. Within days, the Centauri ship was in orbit of Earth, undergoing peaceful trade negotiations with the leaders of the Earth Alliance. Threats of war and secession vanished overnight as humanity learned it was no longer alone in the universe. For the average citizen, the arrival of peaceful aliens was a time of rejoicing. Suddenly, all the petty fears and bickering among Earth's people became a thing of the past. Humanity was no longer trapped on a single habitable world amongst a few useless rocks that made up the rest of the solar system. Now, the entire galaxy was open for exploration. For the more pragmatic among the Alliance, the appearance of a seemingly benevolent race of aliens, possessing far more advanced technology and apparently occupying a very large empire, was met with suspicion and outright fear. The single survey vessel in orbit might have been capable of wiping out most, if not all, of Earth Force naval capabilities on its own, and it was not even a warship. A small fleet could easily bring humanity to its knees, turning Earth into a slave state of the Centauri Republic. In fact, had the Centauri discovered Earth 100 years earlier, such a conquest might well have been the result. Fortunately for humanity, the Republic was now too busy with its own affairs and internal bickering to worry about territorial conquest. In fact, they had already undergone several decades of compaction in which former slave planets broke away and declared independence. The last thing the Centauri needed was to antagonize another sentient race and send it running into the hands of its enemies. Thus, while Earth's leaders declared and solidified their friendship and trade relations with the Centauri, even enduring, with good humor, a laughable attempt by Republic ambassadors to claim Earth as a lost colony, they secretly began working on a crash program to advance the technological base of the Alliance. All differences between the member nations were forgotten under the sudden and very real threat of domination from a much stronger outside power. Fear of the Centauri and other races Earth was just beginning to become aware of, coupled with an almost instinctive desire to join and prosper within the newly discovered galactic arena unified Earth as nothing else ever could. Although the Centauri survey ship claimed to represent the Republic as a whole, in fact they were little more than a splinter group of profiteers flying the flag of House Jado. Totally uninterested in conquest, they saw Earth simply as a means to increase revenues for themselves, not the Republic through foreign trade. Since the naive Terrans knew nothing about the galaxy, House Jado took it upon itself to instruct its new partner in the ways and means of interstellar relations. The Earth representatives sent on these first diplomatic missions to the stars smiled and nodded as the Centauri of House Jado extolled their virtues and pointed out the failures of their rivals among the many other races that seemed scattered throughout nearby space. Publicly, the Earthers pretended to eat this up, while in fact, they gathered information with a remarkable level of impartiality and returned to deliver their reports to the intelligence-starved government in Geneva. From these early missions, the Earth Alliance discovered several facts. First, there were dozens of alien races out there. Second, none were particularly close to Earth. Third, most of the star nations were so bogged down with their own problems that they had no reason to bother with conquering a measly little backwater like Earth. And finally, should that attitude change in the near future, Earth Force would have no chance of defending the homeworld from enslavement or destruction. After a brief period of debate, Earth's leaders met in secret session and decided upon a course of action designed to bring the fledgling alliance into a position of strength in the least amount of time. Because of Earth's distance from most of the stronger alien races, and the fact that even the once mighty Centauri Republic had managed to miss finding them for centuries, the Alliance felt it had a window of opportunity to carve out a foothold in the region before someone stronger came along to seize that territory for themselves. This goal was extremely long-term, and Earth's leaders knew it would take decades to achieve, but they had little choice. Unless they expanded quickly and built up their military, they would be at the mercy of a greater power. Turning the Earth Alliance from a single system into a galactic empire required more than just a lofty ideal and a far-sighted goal. It required a plan eventually referred to as the Aegis program. Aegis was described on paper as a means to protect humanity from any threat, but was, in fact, nothing less than a blueprint for expansion and rapid growth. The leaders in Geneva decided that 3 R's were needed: reconnaissance, relations, and resources. And they were needed now. To accomplish the first goal, Earth Force formed the Deep Space Exploration Command. The first mission of this auspicious organization would be the generation and verification of a comprehensive map of nearby space. The DSE Command began by collecting information from Centauri databases, and verifying this with trips to as many systems as possible. When the Centauri finished constructing a jump gate in Earth orbit in 2159, Earth wasted little time in dispatching their first generation of extrasolar spacecraft to learn the tricks of navigating hyperspace and following beacons to established gates without the aid of the Centauri. To the surprise of these early explorers, many of the systems they encountered were unexploited, simply acting as transfer points for Republic exploration ships as they searched for established races with whom to establish relations. Several viable planets were located and earmarked for future colonization, including Earth's closest neighbor, Proxima Centauri. The second key R, relations, was given to a team of diplomats referred to as the First Contact Committee. This group began by signing a treaty with the Centauri, actually just House Jado, but that was enough for the moment and initiating the flow of trade goods. From this beginning, Earth started to reach out to those nearby races who also traded with House Jado. Lacking any ships capable of visiting these distant nations, the First Contact Committee initially leased space on Centauri vessels, and soon after purchased a pair of smaller craft outright, in order to reach whomever they could. Rather than trust a Centauri interpreter, the cautious Alliance diplomats learned languages on their own prior to departure, ensuring that no possible misunderstandings could result. In this way, Earth made peaceful contact with a dozen nearby races during the early 2160s, including the Markab, Vri, Deneth, Mentabans, and even the more distant Berkiri and Dratzi. However, they did not meet several others, who were either unknown to the Centauri or not on speaking terms with them. These included the Chlonus, Kolani, Torata, Korlians, Yolu, and, regrettably, the Minbari Federation. The final requirement, that of resources, was not so much assigned to any part of the Alliance as it was opened up to whomever wished to exploit it. In much the same way as the Americans opened up their West to anyone who could stake a claim and develop the land, the Earth Alliance opened up nearby space to whatever corporation could locate and secure the resources it offered. In addition, huge bonuses and payoffs were given to those with the wherewithal to acquire technology from whatever source presented itself. Hundreds of private companies sprang up overnight and rushed out into space in the mad hunt for profits, while behind it all the Belt Alliance initiated a steady expansion of its own. It was the Belt Alliance that would quietly form the backbone on which the Earth Alliance was built. But as the Earth Alliance grew, it would be only a matter of time before they encountered a hostile force. And this encounter would prove to be deadly. The decade of the 2160s provided huge benefits to the fledgling Aegis program. The habitable third planet of the Proxima Centauri system became Earth's first extrasolar colony, and thousands of eager settlers flowed forth from Earth looking for a new start. Other nearby systems, such as Orion, Ceti Gamma, and Beta 7, were claimed and occupied by rival corporations, and farther out, New outposts were constructed in places like Beta Durrani, Deneb, Cyrus, Jericho, Vega, and Sinzar. The Earth Alliance purchased Jumpgate technology from the Centauri in 2161, and Earth Force quickly engineered its own jump-capable exploration craft. The original Oracle hull, the EAS Argo, set out on its maiden voyage in 2163 and established many of the earliest traditions of the Deep Space Exploration Command. In addition to locating potential colonies at Vega, New London, and Altair, the EAS Argo and those ships that followed her met with new races like the Corlions, Torata, and Kasker, plus mapped dangerous regions of hyperspace that precluded further study. One unfortunate side effect of this was a cessation of further exploration spinward, near the edge of the galactic arm, due to treacherous regions of hyperspace in that area. Had Earth vessels proceeded in that direction, they might have met the Minbari under less aggressive circumstances. While all of this was going on, Earth Force undertook a crash course in the development of an interstellar space navy. Using components bought from the Centauri and other races, technologies found on distant worlds, and information gathered from other means, Earth's military began to rapidly grow. In power, a major element of this growth was the Starfury program, designed to develop Earth's first non-atmospheric fighter intended solely for interstellar use. Cheap Delta-class fighters, still in use by the Belt Alliance, could operate easily from carriers or ground bases, but these craft were adequate only for a short-range role and could not hope to stand up to a real starfighter. In 2168, the Starfury program bore fruit in the form of the Ares Heavy Fighter, though most people simply referred to the new design simply as a Starfury. This tradition would continue throughout the project's still ongoing lifetime. In addition to this capable fighter, the Alliance also deployed its first real interstellar task force in 2168. Charged with defending the Proxima colony and Earth's growing network of outposts, this group included the Epimetheus-class command ship, the first Terran combat vessel capable of initiating its own jump vortex, as well as early versions of the Hermes Courier, Artemis frigate, Orestes dreadnought, later Monitor, and Tethys frigate. All these vessels were slow and clunky, with weak thrusters and inadequate engines for their missions, but they were literally all Earth had to offer. Their weapons, however, were far more impressive for such a youthful race, including plasma cannons, particle weapons, missile racks, and blast cannons purchased or otherwise acquired from the Centauri and neighboring races. The first Alliance ships did not look like much when maneuvering, but at close ranges they really packed a wallop. Their operational deployment also came at just the right time. The rapidly growing corporations, eager to make a buck, wherever possible, were beginning to infringe upon the territory of neighboring races, and not all of them appreciated the upstart Earthers and their expansionistic attitude. While some lodged formal protests with the Alliance over these gung-ho surveyors, a few reacted more aggressively. The first of these was the Kulani Directorate. The Kulani occupied only a single system, but it was directly in the path of Earth's access to the Tokati, a friendly race looking to establish a viable trade route. The Kulani made no attempt to diplomatically protest the construction of such a route, but instead attacked Earth's outpost at Deneb, then known as the Signet Station, with a cruiser group in April 2169. In this historic first meeting of Earth Force units against an alien foe, the Epimetheus cruiser EAS Asia was heavily damaged and the outpost itself destroyed. While the hardy Ares fighters fought valiantly to delay the Kulani, the Asia and a fleet of shuttles managed to rescue a quarter of the station's crew before the base finally broke apart under concentrated enemy fire. Earth was forced to abandon the system, and the Kulani deactivated the jump beacon without delay. In the time it took the Alliance to bring another jump-capable cruiser into the region, Earth's diplomatic corps managed to defuse the dangerous situation. With only a few dozen ships in the region, most of these light frigates and police craft, Earth was in no position to fight the technologically superior Kulani. Since all the Kulani wanted was to be left in peace, and the active Signet beacon was a threat to that peace, The solution was simply to not reactivate said beacon. This left the colony satisfied, and a nervous Earth force backed cautiously away from its first interstellar conflict. Many lessons were learned from the incident. The Ares fighters had been particularly successful, but were deployed in too few numbers to turn the battle. The EAS Asia was so badly damaged that it had to be decommissioned, but was quickly replaced by the new beta model of the Epimetheus class, which operated a more powerful suite of weapons and the prototype of Earth's first interceptor weapons. Interceptors, developed through technology located by the IPX Corporation during a survey of a long-abandoned alien outpost, was another high point in the Aegis program and was one of the primary advances made to Earth's Navy during the period. Interceptors were the first weapon capable of dramatically increasing the defensive firepower of naval vessels, and were instrumental in freeing up fighters from the traditional escort role to intercept and strike missions. However, perhaps the most important lesson learned was that a quiet neighbor can be a dangerous neighbor. By this point, Earth territory had expanded to the point where it bumped up against a number of alien races. Open trade was underway with the friendly Mentabans, Markub and Centauri, while border treaties had also been signed with the Vri, Deneth, Sh Lassans, and just recently, the Kolani. There was, however, one other race of significant concern, and that was the Ch Lonus. The Ch Lonus were a former Centauri subject race, who valued their own independence and security over just about any other. 1L. Concern. Earth ships attempting to set up trade relations were fired upon and forced to retreat without any attempt at dialogue. The Ch Lonus made no argument when Earth claimed the nearby systems of Deneb and Ceti Gamma, but there was one additional system the Alliance had its eye on, Beta 7, home to a wealth of minerals and resources greatly in need as raw materials for Earth's growing colonization program. Surveyors found no evidence of a foreign claim to the system, despite its proximity to Chlon, so the Alliance decided to take control and hope for the best. After what happened at Signet Station, Earth moved into Beta 7 with great care and deliberation. After publicly broadcasting their peaceful intentions in the area, Earth Force assigned the Avenger Carrier Group to defend the system and began the process of building a mining station. From the beginning, Ch Lonus ships menaced this process, undertaking numerous close-range passes to gather information, but stopping short of actual armed combat. In response, Earth Force constructed heavier fortifications around the mining facilities, including rudimentary defense satellites and ground-based laser batteries to go along with orbital fighter asset. However, when Earth finally began construction of an early Orion-class starbase in late 2169, they finally forced the Ch Lonus into action. Unwilling to permit the existence of a nearby base capable of supporting a strike into their home system, the Ch Lonus attacked in force in late January of the following year. They were met by a well-prepared and heavily armed Alliance task group consisting of the carrier Avenger, the Artemis-class heavy frigates Merrimack and Lincoln, and a veritable horde of Ares-class starfleets. Ch Lonus tactics of the time depended upon use of their ships and fighters in a combined sweeping passes, but time and again the Ares groups drew off defending Ch Lonus fighters into spectacular dogfights, forcing the destroyer group and supporting frigates to break off and regroup. In the end, the Ch Lonus retreated after losing most of their fighters, and while neither side lost a ship, none of those involved escaped the fight without at least some damage. The Earth Alliance responded to this unprovoked attack with outrage, but the Ch Lonus remained characteristically silent. Instead of suing for peace, they seemed content to enter a period of Cold War with their enemies. Earth continued to fortify Beta 7, completing the Orion base in late 2170 and assigning additional ships to defend the system. Meanwhile, the Ch Lonus continued to raid the outpost and neighboring trade routes, although they made no attempt at military strikes against the vital supply line between Beta 7 and Sol. It was not until decades later that Earth Force agents discovered just how much of a paper tiger the Ch Lonus military really was. The vast majority of their ships were lightweight hulls reverse-engineered after the Republic's departure from its former slave state, and even at Earth's level of inferiority, the Alliance had equal or perhaps even better weapons overall than the Chlonus did. Earth could easily have conquered Chlon had they possessed the desire and courage to do so, but of course the Alliance had no intention of becoming an imperialistic nation. In retrospect, this was probably a good attitude to have, and only added to the later developed Terran reputation of being a race not willing to start wars, but perfectly capable of finishing them. As the Earth Alliance steadily grew in power, many among the Centauri Republic began to grow jealous of House Jaddo's improved status. By operating as exclusive traders with the Earthers, Jaddo earned noticeably improved profits and enjoyed a steadily rising level of influence within the Centaurum. While some houses merely wished to establish their own trade relations with the Alliance, others saw House Jaddo as a threat and Earth the key to eliminating that threat. However, as is common within Centauri backroom politics, no direct action was taken. Instead, the disaffected houses began secretly hiring mercenaries and raiders to disrupt the trade lanes between the Alliance and House Jaddo's outposts. In 2172, Earth Force agents discovered evidence directly linking certain Centauri houses with raider activity. Debate raged for some time over what to do. There was no consideration of going to war with the Republic, for any such fight could have only one result. Although Earth's leaders in Geneva were still learning about the intricacies of Centauri politics, they did at least correctly discern that their friends in House Jaddo were not at fault. In secret meetings, Earth's leaders confronted Jaddo with their knowledge and were promised an end to the raids, but in fact, House Jaddo knew about them already and had already chosen to do nothing. The Republic was still in decline, and every house was out to cover its own interests. Jaddo knew that to publicly expose the raids and threaten any sort of action could lead to a disastrous civil war, one they would surely lose. So, instead, they provided only token support in the form of intelligence and technological data, without making any attempt to intervene militarily. Earth's leaders were justifiably annoyed. They had to do something. Already the Centauri raids were spilling over into trade with other star nations. As a result, Earth Force was ordered to gradually build up its forces along the border and aggressively pursue the privateers as far as the trail led, including into sovereign Centauri territory. Previously, Earth forces had stopped at the border, letting raiders escape with their booty, but that practice would henceforth cease. The pirates, desperate to escape, called upon Centauri border patrols to protect them, and incidents began to pile up. In most cases, the Alliance forces so outnumbered Republic pickets that the police craft did not dare intervene, but the raiders soon learned the trick of flying directly towards the nearest military garrison and begging for asylum. The result was a wrist slapping by local authorities and, usually, the return of whatever was stolen, but no reparations for battle damage or destroyed Alliance freighters. Although the Centauri repeatedly protested the violations of their space, Earth continued to aggressively pursue raiding vessels despite the threat of military action. Eventually, things boiled over when an Earth Force fleet opened fire on raiders taking shelter near a Centauri base. The base and picket ships returned fire, and in the resulting battle, most of the Republic's ships were destroyed. As word of this reached Centauri Prime, the Emperor himself finally sat up and took notice. While scattered battles continued on the border, he conducted his own investigation and uncovered the actions of his own people. His response was measured, however, and not nearly as harsh as the Earth Alliance would have liked. The raiding was brought to a halt, and the Emperor issued an apology to Geneva for the actions what was labeled as rogue houses. In addition, he also put an end to the exclusive treaty House Jaddo had with Earth, opening up the entire Republic to trade with the new and emerging power. Although this infuriated Jaddo and angered a number of Terran companies getting rich through their virtual trade monopoly, the Emperor smoothed things over by publicly praising the obvious military skill exhibited by Alliance forces during the border skirmishes. This left the average Earth citizen with a feeling of well-deserved pride. During the years that followed, expansion continued and colonization began throughout what was now being known as Earth space. Borders were solidified, and the Alliance began the long process of developing its vast territory. Colonies were founded and grew, outposts and bases were constructed, and new jump gates were placed and added to the expanding hyperspace network. The old Centauri gate orbiting Earth was deactivated and dismantled, replaced by a new one in orbit around Jupiter's moon Io. This move greatly increased the security of the homeworld itself, as any military force approaching the planet would have to make its way to Earth on its own, without a handy jump beacon to point the right way. As time passed, however, problems within the Alliance began to surface. Colonies such as Mars, Proxima, and Deneb began to voice a growing argument for self-government, increasingly believing the desires of the leaders in Geneva were no longer the same as those on their own planet. Independence movements began to surface, and although Earth managed to quell the problem on the smaller colonies, Mars and Proxima proved more difficult. Mars, in particular, chafed under the demands of the capital at Earth Dome. Demonstrations were held across the planet, and no small amount of support appeared at home. The Alliance insisted that humanity's best interests were better served through unity, while Mars replied that Earth's various colonies should be treated as independent federated states, with complete self-determination in all ways but protected by a joint military force, the expenses of which would be shared by all. While Alliance leaders struggled with these latest internal concerns, Earth finally came into contact with the expanding Narn regime. The Narns had thrown off Centauri rule in 2195 and immediately began the process of building an empire of their own, in much the same way as the Earth Alliance had done in the decades following contact with the Republic. However, where Earth was content to occupy unclaimed systems and made no attempt to infringe upon the rights of established races, the Narns had no such compunctions. Space around their homeworld was littered with the remnants of former Centauri slave races, such as the Tachunk and Belosians. In order to achieve the level of power they wanted, the Narns approached these worlds under the guise of liberators, only to turn them into subject peoples once again. In some cases, as with Tachunk, their efforts met with success, but on other worlds, most notably Belos and Chakfaf, Narn invasions, for that was what they truly were repulsed. In due time, the Narns encountered the borders of the Earth Alliance. Relations were not formally established, and the Centauri Republic warned Earth Dome that the Narns were dangerous rebels who could not be trusted. The Narns saw the Earthers as Centauri collaborators, and harassed and raided Earth trading and exploration operations along the border, seemingly proving the Centauri case. In truth, the Narns were merely probing Earth territory and taking the measure of humanity, but the Terrans had no way to be sure of this. However, these incidents did have one significant benefit. They provided an umbrella under which Earth Force could build up its military without arousing the suspicion or ire of the colonies. For several years, warship and ground force production was of paramount importance. Technological advancements continued, and several new starship designs appeared, including the Olympus and Hyperion prototypes, vessels that would later become the backbone of the Earth Navy for most of the early part of the next century. While many of the new task forces were indeed sent to the Narn frontier, many more were held in reserve for use in quelling any civil unrest. This proved to be a wise decision, for in 2212, the Mars colony erupted in open revolt. Rioting broke out in nearly every city, and the Martian underground moved to take control using its own paramilitary armed forces. When Proxima threatened to do the same, Earth began an overwhelming and well-prepared invasion of Mars, crushing all resistance within the space of a few weeks. During the final days of this revolt, when failure became imminent, a fanatic loyal to Mars managed to assassinate President Kiyoshi. This led to a series of punishing sanctions against the breakaway colony, setting a foul tone for Earth-Martian relations for decades. With the threat of civil war abated, the Alliance was free to concentrate on shoring up the Narn border. The primary subject of argument was the Epsilon Indi system, a jumping-off point to Coriana and one of only 2 star systems with easily navigated jump paths into Narn space. The Narns claimed Epsilon Indi, but in doing so conveniently forgot to notice that Earth explorers had mapped and logged the system many years before. Unfortunately, so few resources existed there, at least in comparison with other nearby systems, that Earth never fully developed the area. This, to the Narns, provided the necessary excuse to move in and occupy it for themselves. During the middle part of the 2210s, the Narns occupied the outer planets in Epsilon Indi while Earth took control of the inner world. Both sides constructed their own jump gates and defensive stations, but neither seemed willing to fight over a few relatively useless chunks of rock. The Narn leadership, the Kari, saw Earth's unwillingness to go to war as a weakness, while the Earth Alliance felt that they just didn't know enough about Narn capabilities to risk an armed conflict. Things could not continue in this way for long, however, and finally in 2219 the fight began. Narn ships attacked an Earth cargo vessel on its way to deliver supplies, and reaction was swift. The Earth commander on the scene ordered a full pursuit of the Narns, and soon a general space battle broke out. Reinforcements were rushed to the scene by both sides, and the fight continued sporadically for the next several days until finally the remaining Narns retreated to the protection of their base. The Narns made a serious blunder at this point, however. Instead of sending in 2 newly formed task forces to counterattack at Epsilon Indi, they instead began raiding Earth systems in Eridani and Epsilon. Although they scored some noteworthy damage, they were eventually driven out by defensive picket forces occupying the threatened areas. The only long-term effect the raids had was to allow new Earth Alliance reinforcements to finally overwhelm the Narn defenses in Epsilon Indi, resulting in the destruction of the base and capturing of the jump gate intact. The beacon was then deactivated, cutting off the system from the Narn regime until assaults could be launched under the control of jump-capable command vessels, of which the still young Narn military was in woefully short supply. The Narns continued to harass the Alliance for the next several years, but were never able to seriously threaten Epsilon Indi or the other colonies. This was due in part to the Narn refusal to commit their entire military might against the Alliance, an action that would have seriously weakened their borders with the Centauri, whom they hated with all their hearts. Indeed, any attempted invasion of the Earth Alliance could have only one result: renewed subjugation, for even victory would have won them only a ravaged navy left wide open to attack by the hated Republic. Earth, too, had no interest in a full-scale war, sticking to their anti-imperialist guns and remaining content to fend off Narn attacks in their sovereign space. In the early years of the 2220s, the Kari finally began to put forth diplomatic feelers, and hostilities finally came to an end with the Epsilon Treaty of 2224. To many in the Earth Alliance, the removal of the Narn threat ended the last serious military risk to humanity. Earth's economic and military might now overshadowed all neighboring races with the exception of the Narn and Centauri, both of whom would never attack Earth without opening the door to an opportunistic counter-invasion by their hated rival. Even the threat of civil war had now been abated, as Proxima and the outer colonies seemed content to return to the old ways following a few needed concessions by Earth Dome. Only Mars continued to seethe under the surface, but there was little they could do in the face of overwhelming Earth force might. Thus, in many ways, the Alliance was exactly where it wanted to be. A period of prosperity and peace settled in, and many optimists suggested that perhaps the risk of interstellar war had finally abated forever. But for Earth, these small encounters proved to be a blessing, as Earth Force was able to work out the kinks in their command and logistics systems. But sadly, in only a few short years, these lessons would be needed to fight in the Dilger War. Far beyond the bounds of Earth territory, in one of the farthest corners of known space, dwelled a race known as the Dilger Imperium. A proud, warrior people, they believed themselves to be the center of the universe. All other races were destined to serve them, in whatever way the Dilger saw fit. Unfortunately, the Dilger were still new to interstellar travel and seemed surrounded by much larger, more capable races than they could ever hope to defeat. What was needed was a long-term plan for conquest, but as it turned out, fate did not give the Dilger that time. Through scientific research, the Dilger learned that their sun would meet a catastrophic end sometime in the coming few decades. Their homeworld of Omelos was doomed. Suddenly they had no choice but to accelerate their plans. To a race as self-centered as the Dilger, asking for help was anathema, and indeed, those in charge never gave it the slightest consideration. No, the Dilger would carve out their own empire using whatever force was required, and then move their entire population to whichever conquered world best met their criteria. In the 2220s, the Dilger became very active in exploring and researching nearby space. Coreward, they found a powerful middleborn race known as the Talconisha, whose vast fleet of living starships brooked not the slightest intrusion. To Anti-Sprial lay only useless, burned-out systems and the void between galactic spiral arms. Their only choices were Spin-Ward and Rim-Ward, where they discovered the scattered and divided races of the League of Non-Aligned Worlds. For many years, Faxer-class spy ships and Protra-class scout vessels roamed through League space and neighboring races, offering trade treaties and establishing diplomatic relations. The crews of these ships were actually highly trained spies adept at gathering intelligence and returning it secretly to their masters back on Omelos. Although some of these ships were caught and destroyed, the League was so compartmentalized that they never suspected what the Dilger were truly up to. Finally, in 2228, the Imperium made its first assault. Their early ship designs, constructed with the fruits of countless stolen technological data, would have been swept aside by most of the other races' larger fleets, so they wisely selected one of the weakest independent powers of the region, the Alakan Republic. Alaka was isolated and had very little in the way of defenses, and was quickly overwhelmed. So quickly was their defeat. Own borders with the Dilger, but they were a pacifistic people and did not see the rape of Alaka as a strong enough reason to go to war. The Dratsi, who also shared a border with the Dilger, were more worried about the enormous Narn regime than an upstart race with only a few planets to its name. The rest of the League saw the Dilger as someone else's problem and ignored it. Had they paid more attention, however, the Dratsi would have been more concerned. Prior to the Alakan invasion, the Dilger had cleverly provoked an incident with the Narns and then rushed to pay reparations, following up their good faith with a treaty of non-aggression designed to keep the regime out of the coming conflict. The ploy worked to perfection, and the Dilger invaded both Dratsi and Abai space simultaneously in 2230, without fear of aggression by the much larger power towards the Rim. Initial successes were met on both fronts. The Abai, who occupied only one colony of any significance, eventually fell back to their homeworld and circled the wagons there, under the guns of their powerful and well-shielded fortifications. The Dratsi also fell back initially, opening up some of their frontier worlds to horrible atrocities by the Dilger, but eventually counterattacked and stabilized a front line. The Dilger, unwilling to sacrifice the immense resources required to break through and utterly destroy their foes, instead settled upon a plan whereby those two borders would be used to initiate and train new crews, test newly designed weapons, and the like, while veteran forces continued to advance into League space. After all, the clock was ticking for the Dilger, and neither the Abai nor the Dratsi possessed a planet capable of supporting the entire population of Omelos. After all, the clock was counting down for the Dilger and its doomed sun. The Abai worlds were unsuitable for the entire population of Omelos, while the size of the Dratsi freehold precluded pacification in a timely manner. The Imperium, therefore, pushed deeper into League space. Thus, in a move that would seem foolish to anyone not comprehending the desperate nature of the Dilger, the invaders pressed their attack further into the League. They occupied the surface of Belos, driving the Belosian people into the underground, where they operated as a guerrilla force for years. From there, the Dilger advanced on Tirith, driving out several races with claims to that system's vast resources. 1Z, and then proceeded to attack those very races directly. Even the powerful, much older Hayek were unable to stand up to the ferocious invaders, instead retreating to their homeworld in much the way as the Abai had done. There, the Hayek retreated behind their bases, keeping the Dilger at bay with powerful long-ranged laser guns. Rather than assault this position and suffer terrible losses, the attackers simply bottled up their enemies as they had the Abai and moved on. The Dilger continued to roll up all opposition as they steadily advanced towards the rim. The Brakiri, Kasker, and Ipsha soon found themselves under attack. Even as these races were bottled up at their respective homeworlds, the League of Non-Aligned Worlds still failed to act with any kind of unity. The races of that loosely organized group simply lacked the will to come to the aid of another, each steadfastly believing that the Dilger would halt their attacks or exclude their nation. None ever thought it could happen to them, until the invasion fleet appeared along the border, by which time it was too late. When the Dilger conquered the tiny race known as the Maitak, they finally found the planet they were looking for. A powerful base of operations was constructed on the Maitak homeworld, and plans were initiated to start shipping population off Amelos to this new site. However, by now the Dilger military had become afflicted with the Conqueror's disease. After so many successes, and with no race strong enough or willing enough to resist them, they saw no reason not to press their attack deeper into the soft underbelly of the League. Further advances were made against the Dratzi, and a breakthrough force knocked the Her out of the war with one single stroke. The weak Deskari were rolled up within weeks, sending much of their population fleeing into nearby space as refugees. The Dilger took great sport in hunting down and destroying these craft wherever possible, even pursuing some of them into the fringes of the Earth Alliance. By this point, Earth Dome was becoming concerned by the Dilger drive. Early on in the invasions, a Dilger task force destroyed the EAS Persephone, later claiming they mistook it for an enemy unit conducting espionage against their military. In fact, this was another attempt by the Dilger to turn a mistake into a non-aggression treaty, just as had been done to keep the Narns out of the war. In this case, however, it backfired, as Earth saw no reason to trust a race that fired first and asked questions later. In fact, the Persephone incident did little more than alert Earth to the threat posed by the Dilger. Still, the Alliance was in no position to intervene in the invasions by itself. Earth had, to this point, never fought a war beyond its own border. They did have a significant military, however, and since they shared no disputed territory with the Dilger, they saw little risk of invasion by a race so far away. The Senate argued for months over what to do, even quietly stepping up warship and fighter production should the need arise to use them, but in the end, they chose to do nothing. Races like the Brakiri and Abai were far away, and the average citizen saw no reason to risk human lives to protect these distant aliens. Even the arrival of the Pyratinia and an escort of League ships could not change the minds of the Senate. The League envoy did, however, provide valuable technological information in the form of captured Dilger fighters, the examination of which proved instrumental in improvements to the Starfury project. Eventually, the Dilger advanced one step too far. They chose to invade Markab space. The Markab were one of Earth's strongest allies and best trading partners, and more than that, they shared a significant border with the Alliance. From either Tyre or Markab itself, the Dilger could then directly threaten Altair, one of Earth's primary jump nexuses. Almost simultaneously with this invasion, the Pyratinia envoy, led by Ambassador Kalika of the Abai, made a final, desperate plea for Earth intervention. In this critical speech, Kalika compared the Dilger to the oppressive Nazi regime of the mid-1900s. That, along with the suddenly visible threat to Earth's security, finally opened the eyes of most of the Senate. Although the Alliance had warned the Dilger on numerous occasions not to attack the Markab, the Dilger were unimpressed by Earth itself. Protras scout ships, sent out in the late 2220s, reported that Earth territory was a hollow shell and its people singularly unwilling to fight. What was more, they insisted, The Terrans would never intervene directly unless the Dilger made the mistake of crossing the border, something they were very careful not to do. While this strategy would have paid big dividends had the Alliance chosen not to attack, the unwillingness of the Dilger to even consider the possibility of an Alliance attack left their badly overextended forces vulnerable to a concentrated strike. Shunning diplomatic niceties such as a declaration of war, the Earth Expeditionary Force crossed the Markov border and engaged Dilger fleets in early 2232. In doing so, they took the Imperium completely by surprise. Although militarily they perhaps possessed the strength to resist Earth's early attacks, they were already at the fringes of their supply lines. What was more, the Imperium had awakened in the Markov a desperate need for revenge. The deeply religious Markov declared a jihad against the invaders and threw themselves against Dilger with unfettered fury. This accelerated the Earth Alliance's pursuit of the Dilger during their retreat, lest their allies destroy themselves against Dilger fortifications. For the better part of a year, the Earth Expeditionary Force, under the command of Admiral Hamato, gradually drove the Dilger back one system at a time. Now the Dilger propensity to surround homeworlds but leave them alone for later pacification worked against them, as the advancing alliance freed up these bottled military assets for use against the Dilger. The collected national fleets, out for revenge against their terrible oppressors, formed into a huge, poorly coordinated armada known as the Liberation Navy. While this group moved from homeworld to homeworld, setting free such races as the Kasker, Berkiri, Hayek, and Abai, the Earth Expeditionary Force pressed the attack directly against Dilger bases and supply lines. The Imperium's promised new homeworld of Mytok was lost, and in their anger the retreating Dilger turned the planet into an irradiated wasteland. They performed similar atrocities at each liberated colony world, infuriating the people of the Earth Alliance and leaving no room for negotiations. The people of Earth, treated daily to new scenes of genocidal acts on the part of the Imperium, knew just how close they had come to suffering a similar fate. Indeed, they felt the only appropriate response was to pound the Dilger right back to the Stone Age. Eventually, the Dilger were driven back to their fortified positions at Alika, Belos, Tasoulas, and Amelos itself. Tasoulas was the only system protecting the Drazi front, while Belos was the key to resisting the advancing Earth Expeditionary Force. The remaining Dilger forces, now finally concentrated, were preparing to knock the Drazi completely out of the war when Admiral Hamato launched his offensive against Belos. He began by sending elements of the Free Belosian Navy, who had escaped the original invasion years before, intending to draw out the Dilger defenders and spring the expeditionary fleet upon them in ambush. In this, Hamato employed another of the complex military plans that made him famous, but in this particular instance, his legendary luck and skill did not produce the desired results. The Dilger did not take the bait, and in fact turned the tables by setting up an ambush of their own. Having temporarily retreated from Belosian space, the Dilger returned with unexpected strength and managed to catch the Earth fleets in the process of landing troops to liberate the planet. The Alliance was forced to withdraw, leaving Gropo's units on the surface for months until a follow-up assault could be organized. This apparently grave setback ultimately proved to be an unexpected boon to the Alliance when the stranded ground forces linked up with Belosian guerrilla armies, who had been harassing the Dilger garrisons for months. Natural underground dwellers, the Belosians and their new and well-equipped Gropo's brethren became quite a thorn in the side of the occupying army, and when Hamato launched his second strike, they simultaneously sabotaged command and control centers, ground batteries, and communication stations, crippling the Dilger defense effort. The Dilger naval elements put up a valiant fight, but in the end the might and fury of the Earth fleets was too much to resist. The Dilger retreated for good, sabotaging their fortifications at Belos and Alika, and pulling back to their fortress at Amelos. After the Drazi took Tasoulas, they were suckered into an ill-advised assault on the homeworld, which was repulsed with heavy losses. The Dilger hoped, in vain, that the sheer firepower of their defenses would be enough to make at least the Terrans reconsider. They were wrong. In late 2232, the assault on Omelos began. This battle was perhaps the most ferocious, vicious fight ever seen in known space. No quarter was asked by either side, and none was given. Crippled craft routinely rammed enemy units, and both sides employed numerous weapons of mass destruction. Admiral Hamato was killed when his flagship was smashed by a suicide attack, but in the end his forces won the day. The Dilger were defeated, with only a few ships escaping into hyperspace. Most of these were later hunted down, but the one containing War Master Jadur, perhaps the worst of the war criminals, was never found. The victorious League forces imposed sanctions against the Dilger intended to prevent them from ever taking aggressive action again. All surviving Dilger citizens were rounded up and quarantined on their homeworld, and orbital satellites were placed to prevent any military construction or space flight of any kind. The victors remained unaware of the impending doom the Dilger faced, a fact the Dilger strangely allowed to remain hidden. In 2235, the secret came out, as the stellar event the Dilger scientists predicted came to pass. All life was scoured from the face of Omelos, driving the Dilger fire right out of the universe. With the end of the Dilger, Earth became a major power in the galaxy. The League, Narn and even the Centauri openly admitted that the new Earth Alliance was now a force to be respected. The fleet returned to Earth space in 2233 after a long victory tour of the League. It had been reduced to less than a third of its original strength. Hundreds of ships had been destroyed, while other still functional vessels had proved themselves inadequate to the demands of modern warfare. Still, the Navy had learned a great deal about space combat, while salvaged ships from the Dilger and League fleets brought new technologies to Earth Force R&D. The EF's crews were broken up and reassigned all over the fleet, so the techniques learned during the Long War were spread to the rest of Earth Force. A new generation of officers experienced in dealing with alien races and long-term space travel rose up, drawn from the veterans of the Dilger War. During the war, the Alliance also developed and deployed the Starfury Nova, a craft made possible through the direct application of technology taken from captured Dilger Thoruns. This fighter proved only a stepping stone to the more powerful and capable Aurora-class Starfury, redevelopment of the old Nova that incorporated Dilger-designed stabilizers and combat software which remains in service today. The other great prize of the war was pulse cannon technology, which quickly became one of the primary weapons used by many Alliance designs. Although the Starfury Nova was quickly obsolete and removed from the inventory, its name continues to live on in the Nova Dreadnought, a powerful gunship introduced in the prototype from during the war and later fitted with combined laser/pulse weapons. Few ships of the era could stand up to a ship of this level of firepower in a head-to-head shooting match. In addition to the positive effects on Earth's morale, total victory over the Dilger also provided huge technological advantages. The Dilger possessed weapons of a type never before seen, among them bolter and pulsar guns capable of operating not only in offensive ship-killing mode, but equally well as anti-fighter defense systems. These weapons led directly to the invention of the first pulse cannon by Earth Force in 2240, and corresponding improvements to ship designs like the Hyperion, Olympus, Artemis, Tethys, and Sagittarius. Many of these classes getting improved sensor and fusion reactor upgrades that increased their speed and range. Orbital satellites and Orion space stations also benefited from new tech as well. Earth would also use these new technologies to construct the first Explorer-class ship. The first one, launched in 2243, were massive vessels, bigger than any other ship built before. While the Army had suffered only minor losses during the Dilger War, Command decided to re-equip the ground forces with a new generation of tanks and ground vehicles. Ground attacks during the Dilger War had suffered terrible logistic problems. The Army was still using vehicles drawn from the vehicle pools of the various nation-states that contributed troops, so different divisions used different and incompatible tank models. Shipping spare parts and supplies across tens of parsecs had proved extraordinarily difficult during the war, so the Army switched over to using a single basis chassis on which different mission-specific turrets could be mounted. The war also saw a massive increase in recruitment, as thousands of young men and women rushed to enlist to fight the Dilger after seeing images and news reports of Dilger atrocities on other worlds. By 2240, there were over 2,000 new Earth Force personnel in service for every single one who died fighting the Dilger. The military grew faster than most politicians felt comfortable with, and soon pressure was put on the military to slow down its recruiting and weapon production to redistribute money and resources to the civilian population. The victory over the powerful Dilger was indeed a time of great rejoicing. The Alliance had, over the course of only 70 years, gone from a nation just beginning its first interstellar forays into one powerful enough to fight and defeat an advanced force that had all but conquered over a dozen established races. In the process, they effectively established themselves as one of the dominant powers in the region, taking their rightful place alongside the Centauri and Narns and earning the respect of both races. Indeed, both the Republic and regime were resigned to making hollow accusations about how the other race had allowed an empire as horrible as the Dilger to run rampant. Beyond mere technology, however, the Dilger War had changed Earth Force forever. Earth had successfully intervened in the affairs of the galaxy, winning the respect of the League and putting themselves on a par with the two current great powers, the Narn and the Centauri. EarthGov's foreign policy began to change, becoming more open to more interventions and peacekeeping operations. New ship designs were tested in clashes with Drazi rebels, with raiders, during the hunt for the surviving Dilger, and in dozens of minor police actions within and just outside the borders of the Alliance. The period following the Dilger War is often looked upon as the golden age of Earth Alliance power and influence. The races of the League all but fell over themselves in the rush to thank and reward the valiant Terrans, who sacrificed so much to liberate alien races many light years from their own territory, and in some cases whom they had never even met. Generous treaties were formed with most of these appreciative nations, and the Alliance was quite helpful in reconstruction efforts when possible. Some of the more xenophobic nations feared the Terrans would attempt to occupy and hold some of their captured territory, but these fears proved groundless. Earthdome had no intention of hanging on to systems located so far from their own borders, turning over the responsibility of guarding Amelos to the League in 2233 and formally abandoning all their logistics stations over the next several years. Some of these facilities were scuttled, while others were purchased by League races or fell into the hands of one power or another. One forward logistics base, located in the Tirith system, became the headquarters of the Tirith Free State, one of the more civilized raider bands, who used it to set up an independent nation of their own. Earth's economy was not harmed by the Dilger conflict, but in fact showed remarkable improvement. The need for a strong military had been proven beyond a shadow of a doubt, and few citizens protested the replacement of lost units and concentration of effort on research and development. Exploration, which came virtually to a halt during the Dilger invasion, resumed with a vengeance following the war. Earth's people were happy, its military was strong, and its reputation among the galactic powers was impeccable. The Alliance stood poised on the brink of true greatness. Spin-off technologies from the war and the reconstruction effort re-energized the sluggish Earth economy, which was then able to take advantage of the massive market offered by the League's rebuilding. Earth Force vessels were soon seen escorting massive trade convoys from Proxima and Earth, making their way to countless League worlds to help their rebuilding efforts and maintaining diplomatic relations. For many in the League, the Earth Alliance's goodwill and would end up being one-sided. By 2237, Earth Force had largely rebuilt the Navy, and the pressures of population and industrial demand for supplies called for a new phase of exploration. The first prototypes of the mighty Explorer-class vessels were built, and several Hyperions and Novas were given over to the newly formed Explorer Corps. Earth Force signed a new contract with salvage corporations like IPX, getting first refusal on any military technology uncovered by their efforts. Earth Force constructed a new network of hyperspace communications relays throughout the Alliance, linking distant outposts in near real-time communication with Earth. Logistics bases and defense satellites were constructed on dozens of worlds. As Earth Force pushed out, they encountered races such as the Pakmare and Moradi, all of whom were cowed by the military might of the Alliance. The fleet seemed virtually invincible, with the Centauri in slow decline and the Narn locked in a fruitless Cold War with their old oppressors. The Earth Alliance seemed poised for ascendancy over known space. By 2245, the Earth Alliance had pushed far beyond its original borders and had eclipsed the still mighty Centauri Republic as the preeminent military and economic power of the known galaxy. The most notable clash of the period was the brief bug war of 2240, when the game decided to test the Alliance's resolve. A surprise attack was launched on Seti Gamma, and tens of thousands of game warriors flooded onto the planet. Groppo's teams reinforced the colonial defenses, and the game were beaten back. The aliens abandoned their defeated foot troops, and instead sent diplomats to sign a non-aggression pact with the Alliance. Earth Force intelligence suspect that the attack was a test that Earth had passed, although why the game chose such a risky method to engage humanity remains a mystery for the xenopsychologists. Following the end of the game attacks, Earth also had to deal with a small incursion by a race called the Sodon. This race was nomadic and came from the rimward edge of Earth space. The attacks lasted for several months, but ended after they moved towards what would soon be known as Minbari space. This conflict would be one of the main reasons Earth would send an expedition to the region that would have horrific consequences. But the war did have one unfortunate side effect, however. Earth's pride became swelled to the point where its leaders and military officers possessed an inflated view of their own abilities and strength. Despite warnings from the Centauri and other races, they saw themselves as capable of anything and deserving of a proper level of respect from everyone they met. They had not yet learned the lesson that, despite all their accomplishments and apparent power, they were as gnats before some of the technologically advanced races lurking out there in the galaxy. This was a lesson they would soon learn the hard way. As Earth exploration continued to expand, they began to hear rumors of an advanced but reticent race known as the Minbari Federation. So far, Earth intelligence personnel had known little or no contact with this mysterious people, despite the fact that they all but shared a border. The nature of hyperspace along Earth's spinward fringe did not lend to easy travel, and so most surveyors gave the region a wide berth. However, as hyperspace exploration became easier and less dangerous, Earth vessels started probing the area with greater interest. One such group was the Prometheus Task Force, led by one Captain Jankowski, a seasoned veteran of the Dilger conflict who believed Earth's forces superior to anything else in the galaxy. It was unfortunate that such a man chanced to be in command of the first military force to encounter the Minbari, for that race, too, was equally confident in its own technological superiority. Worst of all, among the Minbari flotilla was the flagship of the Grey Council, which at that very moment was on a mission to explore the rim. Upon detection of the Earth Task Force, the Minbari closed with the Alliance fleet, hoping to set up a friendly dialogue. Unfortunately, communication proved impossible, as Minbari sensors were so powerful they overwhelmed the unprepared Earth network, shutting down circuits and deactivating jump drives. Captain Jankowski believed this to be a hostile act and put his ships on alert. When the Minbari ships entered firing range with gun ports open, a traditional show of respect among the Minbari warrior caste, Jankowski panicked and opened fire. The close-range salvo crippled the Valentha, the Grey Council's flagship, and killed Dukat, the chosen one and spiritual leader of the Minbari people. In the resulting confusion, Jankowski was able to withdraw his forces, but the damage was done. In that single act, he aroused in the Minbari a terrible thirst for vengeance. With a singleness of purpose, the Minbari people moved to make the humans pay. And pay they did. The Minbari launched an immediate search for human worlds, which they so far had not bothered to map. They tracked Jankowski back to his base and destroyed everything they found there, but in the process the jump beacon was cut, denying the Minbari access to much of Earth space. This forced the enraged Federation to scour the region and gave the Alliance much-needed time to shore up defenses and maximize production. In this the Alliance hoped to buy enough time to fend off the Minbari in the outlying colonies long enough to come to some sort of diplomatic solution. It was a sound plan with one fateful catch. The Minbari had no intention of talking with the Alliance to discuss matters. Spurring all contact, they instead concentrated solely on destroying Terran military forces and slaughtering Earth Force personnel. The Alliance could do nothing to stop the inexorable advance. Even the most powerful vessels in the Earth inventory were no match for Minbari forces, which continually attacked with overwhelming strength. One by one the outer systems fell. Sinzir, Vega, Cyrus, Jericho. Nothing, it seemed, could stop the avenging Minbari host. The problem was not simply one of weapon firepower. Indeed, in terms of close-range direct destructive ability, the Nova Dreadnought was perhaps the equal of the Charlan cruiser. However, the Minbari had more than just big guns in their favor. They possessed better armor, longer-range sensors, advanced gravitic propulsion systems, and best of all, a jamming system capable of preventing their inferior enemies from achieving any sort of useful weapons lock. Fighters, too, were perhaps equal in maneuverability and staying power, but the Minbari Nile, or Nighthawk, simply could not be locked onto by the otherwise capable Aurora Starfaries. This allowed Nile pilots to engage at range, carving up Starfaries before they could even the odds in a close-quarters dogfight. As the war pressed on, Earth was reduced to fighting desperate holding actions in the hopes of buying time for refugees to escape doomed outposts. Unable to turn the tide alone, the Alliance began to search the galaxy for outside help, all but begging the other powers for military or economic aid. The Centauri demurred, fearful of bringing Minbari vengeance upon themselves, and simply told the beleaguered Terrans that they were warned not to provoke that which they did not understand. The races of the League, while publicly supportive for their former liberators, knew full well that their ships would be as useful as a thrown rock in the face of a fanatic fleet of Minbari Charlans. They, too, did not send military aid, although the Brakiri and Abai did provide ships and support for evacuation and medical purposes. Only the Narns intervened directly by selling the Alliance weapons and other vital war material, gambling that the Minbari would stop at Earth and not pursue revenge against the regime. The addition of this new technology, while helpful on the surface, really did little to stem the Minbari tide. In desperation, Earth's new strategy was to evacuate all non-essential personnel and sabotage jump beacons, denying the Federation a direct path to the next colony. Despite this, the Minbari relentlessly searched along the various paths one after the other, rooting out and destroying Earth's ships with ruthless abandon. Even counterattacks aimed at cutting off supply lines failed, for the Minbari were meticulous about planting defensive forces in every system they conquered. More than one Alliance task force arrived at a fallen colony with dreams of liberation, only to be crushed to the last fighter. Sometimes word of their fate never even reached Earth, so swift was Minbari response to such efforts. The lone success in the war was that of Commander John Sheridan, who assumed command of a Hyperion-class cruiser after the death of his captain and then managed to destroy a Minbari task group flagship through a deception. Pretending to be disabled, he lured the Black Star in on an attack run and detonated pre-placed nuclear explosives in nearby asteroid. The powerful Minbari cruiser was destroyed, and Earth had its first hero of the war. Still, even this was not enough. After a momentary pause, The Minbari advance proceeded steadily and with deliberate precision. The Alliance tried everything to halt the attackers, including desperate ramming attacks along with various traps and ambushes. The Minbari would not be fooled again. They checked every corner and turned over every rock as they drove on towards Earth. Cyrus fell, and Jericho, and soon the Federation fleets were attacking Earth's largest and most vital colony at Proxima. When contact with that final bastion was lost, the Alliance called its remaining forces home and prepared for the worst. The worst was not long in coming. The Minbari found Sol and approached with the core of their mighty armada. Earth deactivated the Io jump gate and activated an experimental solar blanketing device intended to prevent Minbari jump drives from functioning inside the asteroid belt. In the meantime, Earth Force called upon every ship or fighter capable of flying to form a line of defense around the homeworld. Earth must not fall, they declared, or it would mean the end of the human race. The line was drawn, they said, and the Minbari must not be allowed to cross. The Minbari were not deterred. They arrived in the Sol system and made immediately for the capital, bypassing Io and ignoring Mars. The latter broadcast frantic messages of its own neutrality at the incoming fleet, a move that might have saved it had the attackers not already been seeking bigger game. Although this infuriated Earth Dome, there was little the Alliance could do at this point against this traitorous act. Later, the leaders of Mars would say they did what they did in an attempt to ensure the survival of at least some fragment of humanity, but Earth knew full well they were merely seizing an opportunity to once again claim independence. This attitude would poorly color Earth-Mars relations for years following the conflict. In the end, the Minbari ignored Earth's jump shield technology and exited hyperspace just outside the cobbled-together wall of desperate defenders. The invaders made no effort to bypass this line of defending ships and attack from another angle, but instead tore right into the flimsy Earth Defiance. The resulting battle was brutal and bloody, and could have only one final result. Yet, in the midst of what must have seemed to be overwhelming superiority, the Minbari did the unthinkable. Without any sort of explanation, they suddenly heaved to and surrendered. The leaders in Geneva met this move with flabbergasted shock. While Earth's few surviving ships regrouped, leery of some kind of trick, the President and her staff met with the Grey Council and accepted the immediate surrender of all Minbari forces. Incredibly, inexplicably, miraculously, the war was over, and Earth had won. Now came the long and painful ordeal of rebuilding their colonies and fleet. But even now, from the shadows the foundation for the next war was being laid. Not one of defense, but one of tyranny and fear. The surrender of the Minbari left the Earth Alliance in disarray. At first no one could believe it. Surely the Federation was involved in some sort of plot. Perhaps they wished to demonstrate their overwhelming superiority, and then turn the surviving humans into slaves. Yet even these terrible fears soon seemed unfounded. The Minbari proved the war was over when they left only a token embassy behind and pulled completely out of Earth space, not just from Earth but from every colony and outpost they had occupied during their invasion. They made no attempt to take prisoners, steal technology, or sabotage those installations they left behind. If they were indeed conquerors, they were like no conqueror the humans had ever seen. With the departure of the Minbari, the Alliance found itself with a monumental task ahead of it. The Federation, despite surrendering, made no offers of aid or restitution, but simply left the smoking ruin of a once proud space empire in their dust. Fortunately, in the final days of the assault, the Minbari did not destroy every ship and installation they found with the sort of single-minded determination observed early in the war. Instead, they were content to pacify what resistance they found and press on towards Earth. This had the side effect of allowing the Alliance to quickly repair and recommission a large number of heavily damaged starships, mostly of the Olympus and Hyperion class. In addition, a new generation of Myrmidon light combat vessels was swiftly constructed and sent to defend the colonies. With these, Earth quickly restored their frontier borders and secured them against alien incursion. While the Kolani and Chlonus both sent forces into Earth space to test the defenses, they retreated quickly in the face of determined Earth task forces. These lone Earth groups made up of those grizzled survivors still capable of fighting, knew full well that they were all that stood between the remnants of the Alliance and an opportunistic alien invasion. They stood firm and towed the line yet again, and both races retreated after only a few skirmishes, believing that the Alliance survived the war in better shape than they actually had. In fact, Earth space would have been an easy target for any alien race with enough determination and ships to invade, but no one dared risk it. After all, Earth somehow managed to survive total war with the Minbari. In fact, it was the Minbari who had finally surrendered, a fact the Federation did not bother to hide. Why would the Minbari, an apparently unstoppable juggernaut, do this without good reason? What if the Minbari were now thralls of the Alliance through some unknown means? No one wanted to bring the wrath of the Federation down upon their heads next by provoking the Alliance. Of course, not everyone believed such a wild theory, but then, the Minbari surrender defied all other logic. The most likely explanation seemed to be that the Alliance withheld some sort of terrible doomsday weapon that they threatened, at the last, to visit upon both forces as an act of spite. Yet the Minbari said nothing about any such device, and while Earth diplomats were quick to seize upon it as a way to save face following what had been, for all intents and purposes, a disastrous defeat, they knew such an explanation would never stand up for long. They milked it for all it was worth, however, buying enough time to rebuild Earth force, recolonize their outposts, and return the Alliance to as much of its former state as was physically possible. In addition to the repairs on existing hulls and new construction in surviving shipyards, Earth Force was also forced to recognize the superiority of the Minbari Charlan war cruiser. No one in the Alliance had the slightest clue why the Minbari retreated when they did, and so there was no reason to expect they might not one day return to finish the job they started. Therefore, one of Earth's immediate goals was to develop some sort of craft capable of standing up to a Charlan in direct combat. The Nova, while indeed powerful, was simply not equal to the task, for it lacked the speed and maneuverability to engage the superior Minbari war vessels, and the long-range weapons needed in a match with the Minbari cruiser. To this end, a crash construction program developed a hybrid hull referred to as the Omega Destroyer. The Omega employed the best aspects of the Nova heavy weapons emplacements and a well-armored superstructure, with a gravity-positive rotating section and an array of defense weapons second to none. Even this craft, however powerful and capable, was still only a stopgap measure, for it alone was still not the equal of a Charlan. Something better was needed. Indeed, an entirely new generation of Earth ship and fighter designs was required. As a result, a series of longer-ranged programs were initiated to produce these vessels, the first fruits of which are now beginning to appear in the form of advanced Thunderbolt-class fighters. As to what lies beyond, all anyone knows for sure are veiled rumors of a top-secret vessel codenamed Warlock. No other information is available about this black project at this time. In addition to rebuilding their military, the Earth Alliance began a more extensive exploration campaign to expand their knowledge of the Outer Rim and to make contact with new races on their terms. For this task, several more Explorer-class ships were built for the task. But these ships were commanded by captains who were better trained in diplomacy and level-headed thinking to avoid what is now called the Jankowski effect. Sometime after the end of the war, once it became apparent that the Minbari had no intention of resuming the conflict, the leaders of Earth decided that they could not allow themselves to be brought to the edge of destruction once again. Ignorance of galactic power and politics had led them to the brink of doom, and the lack of any central forum to plead their case gave them no opportunity to offer reparations or make their case for peace. The Dilgar invasion, also, was allowed to progress as far as it did because the League of Non-Aligned Worlds lacked the wherewithal to warn the others or request aid against the threat. Something was needed, some focal point where diplomats could meet in neutral space, to provide an outlet for grievances and diplomatic discussions. Thus was the Babylon Project born. The Alliance chose a neutral site as close as possible to the conflux of Earth, Narn, Centauri, Minbari, and League territory. Here, they began construction on a massive starbase capable of supporting ambassadors from every known race and culture. At this site, representatives of all governments could meet in peace and resolve their differences. Earth's leadership wanted there to be no chance of any future misunderstandings, involving either themselves or anyone else, that could lead to a galactic war. Constructing the Babylon station proved more difficult than it first appeared on paper. Not everyone agreed that such a place should exist. At least one of the first 3 stations is known to have been directly destroyed by sabotage, while others were lost in suspicious accident. The 4th, and largest, simply vanished on the eve of activation, with no trace ever found. Thoroughly disheartened, Earth was about to abandon the project entirely when the funds needed to construct the 5th and final Babylon station arrived from a totally unexpected provider: the Minbari Federation. The Minbari, it seemed, had their reasons for wanting the station built. For certain considerations, they offered to pay for virtually the entire construction project, although they invited and later accepted further help from the Centauri, Narns, and League of Non-Aligned Worlds. Although Babylon 5 was not nearly the size of Babylon 4, it was still quite capable of performing its intended function. It came online in 2256, ushering in a new era in the realm of galactic affairs. No longer did the races bicker and argue behind closed doors, or operate in a political vacuum. Now they had a place to meet and share their experiences and differences. With the help of Babylon 5, the age of interstellar war seemed past. Yet, despite all that has been accomplished, the Earth Alliance remained in turmoil. The question of what to do with Mars was still not answered, and the growing rift between telepaths and mundanes remained a significant concern. The reason for the Minbari surrender had never been adequately determined. Worst of all, there seemed to be constant rumblings out on the rim and beyond, rumors of a strange new power rising to the fore, threatening to draw the Alliance once more into conflict. Babylon 5 came online in 2257 under the command of Geoffrey Sinclair, a war hero known for his role in the Battle of the Line. Sinclair's appointment as station commander surprised many within Earth Force Command. It was later revealed that the Minbari had significant influence in his selection as part of the conditions for funding Babylon 5's construction, as they considered him their preferred candidate. The year 2258 of Babylon 5 was anything but mundane. The station narrowly escaped destruction at the hands of the Vorlons when their ambassador, Kosh, faced an assassination plot. Babylon 5 also made first contact with a race known as the Soul Hunters, who were at the time stalking Minbari ambassador Delenn. Moreover, the station encountered the Ru Harus, an ancient race that served the Vorlons. This first contact led to the discovery of an ancient machine built by the Vorlons under Epsilon 3. A short time later, other members of this race arrived to claim the planet. This encounter quickly turned into a hostile but brief battle between Babylon 5 and the Hyperion heavy cruiser Hyperion herself, resulting in the extinction of the Ru Harus. Babylon 5 solved the mystery of its predecessor, Babylon 4, by rescuing the crew before it disappeared into a time rift. The station also proved its military value by successfully destroying a significant group of raiders. Closure came to the hunt for the last of the Dilger war criminals when War Master Jodder, aka Deathwalker, arrived at the station with an elixir promising immortality. She was killed by the Vorlons on her way to Earth, marking the end of the Dilger threat in the galaxy. With the successes of Babylon 5, President Luis Santiago made a special visit to the station as part of a goodwill tour aimed at improving relations with other races. During this visit, an assassination attempt occurred just as his ship, Earth Force One, was about to dock. Although this plot was foiled, it later became clear that it was not the main attempt. Station Security Chief Michael Garibaldi inadvertently uncovered another effort to kill the president but was shot and wounded by a member of his security team who was involved in the plot. By the time the station command staff realized what was happening, it was too late. As Earth Force One passed by the Io jump gate, a series of explosions ripped through the ship, killing everyone on board. Vice President Morgan Clark, who had left the ship a day earlier due to illness, quickly assumed control of the Earth Alliance and began making changes that would undo much of President Santiago's work. As 2258 came to a close, President Clark started issuing orders to restructure key leadership positions. One of his first actions was to recall Commander Sinclair from Babylon 5 and reassign him to Minbar as Earth's first ambassador. Sinclair would be replaced by Captain John Sheridan, another well-known war hero known to be disliked by the Minbari. This change was intended to help secure the station under Earth's control, as many believed the Minbari had too much influence while Commander Sinclair was in charge. As the Earth Alliance entered 2259, the Narn and Centauri were on the brink of war, and the League of Non-Aligned Worlds were beginning to turn on one another as whispers of a new power began to surface. In all, the new year would start with confusion and tragedy. In the year 2259, Captain John Sheridan was assigned as the new commander of Babylon 5, replacing Ambassador Jeffrey Sinclair, now stationed to Minbar as Earth's first ambassador. Just as he was taking command, Captain Sheridan had to deal with a significant political and tactical crisis regarding the Minbari war cruiser, the Trigati. The ship did not stand down as the other Minbari warships did at the end of the war, but instead went into self-exile for almost 12 years. While the Trigati crisis was resolved, it would be the first of many that would put Babylon 5 on the front lines. When the Explorer-class ship EAS Cortez was lost in hyperspace, Babylon 5 launched a risky but ultimately successful rescue of the ship, the first time in Earth's history. The station also hosted a massive number of mystical technomages as they passed through to their hiding sanctuary. One of the station's greatest honors was when the Centauri Emperor Turhan visited the Babylon 5 on a mission of peace. His intent was to end the built-up hostilities between the Centauri and the Narn by meeting with the Narn ambassador and apologizing to his people for the horrors inflicted upon the Narn people. But sadly, before this was to come, the Emperor's hearts gave out and soon died before he could deliver his message of peace. What few knew was that in the background, several factions were preparing to seize control of the throne and place the Emperor's mad nephew, Cartagia, in his place as a puppet. As Emperor Turhan closed his eyes for the last time, the Narn would declare war on the Centauri. The War of Retribution had begun. Babylon 5 got a massive upgrade in late 2259 when Major General Richard Franklin used the station as a staging area for a large military operation. The new upgrades included pulse cannons, energy mines, more particle beams, an improved interceptor system, targeting and tracking scanners, and the hangars were updated to accommodate the new Thunderbolt and Badger fighters that were now coming into service. The Narn-Centauri War would drag Earth into conflict on several occasions. Two of them were at Babylon 5 because of the blockade in response to Centauri weapons smuggling, and when a Narn heavy cruiser arrived after the war seeking sanctuary. In both encounters, the Centauri ships were destroyed with a massive loss of life. Another encounter also took place in Earth space when the Centauri attacked a refugee convoy that had entered Earth space to avoid Centauri patrols. A small battle between Earth and the Centauri took place at the New London colony. But this encounter would result in it being the deadliest, with the loss of 2 Omega destroyers and 9 older Centauri ships. It was clear that the situation was getting out of control. The War of Retribution ended in October with the bombing of the Narn home world. The The Centauri using mass drivers to bombard the planet drew great outrage from all races. These weapons were outlawed following the Dilger War. This resulted in Earth beginning formal talks with the Centauri. What most didn't know is that these talks were to establish a non-aggression pact between the two powers to avoid any future conflict. This treaty was one of many programs used by now President Morgan Clark to help strengthen his control over Earth and please his secret allies, the Shadows. As 2259 closes, conspiracies and plots are being made and exposed by all sides. It will only be a matter of time before they all explode into chaos. During the year 2259, President Morgan Clark began making massive changes to Earth Force Command as well as political appointees to key positions. Many did not know that Clark was secretly in league with the ancient race known as the Shadows. Through their emissaries, such as the charming but cunning Mr. Morden, President Clark began to implement a xenophobic agenda to isolate Earth from the coming Shadow War. The Shadows wanted Earth to be on their side, much like the Centauri were meant to be when it was time. To help secure his position and eliminate any possible threats, Clark created several new organizations to keep people in line and in control. The first of these was Nightwatch. This program started as a type of side job for most Earth Force personnel, making couple of hundred extra credits a month just to keep an extra eye on things. Several thousand personnel signed up, many not knowing the true insidious path they were about to travel on. Over time, Nightwatch was given more and more authority to initiate investigations and report on all activities or any other perceived anti-Clark actions or negative rhetoric against the government. In time, Nightwatch would be turned into a secret police force loyal only to Clark. The second one was the Ministry of Peace. This organization was to maintain diplomatic control of all Earth politicians through blacklisting or political pressure to make sure they stayed in line with the president's agendas and followed orders. It was this organization that pushed through the Earth-Centauri peace treaty at the expense of the Narn, which is something the Shadows insisted on. Many Earth senators would find themselves as post non grata after voicing their concerns over President Clark's actions. The ministry worked closely with Nightwatch to remove personnel both civilian and military from their positions under the ruse of them being disloyal. In time, most people just stopped trying to stand up for what's right more out of fear of retaliation on themselves or their families for speaking up. The last one is the Ministry of Truth. This was Clark's propaganda machine. They made sure that the news was censored from telling or showing anything that might embarrass or hurt the administration, such as the Mars Rebellion or telepaths doing random and illegal scans of anyone they saw for any reason regardless of that person's right to privacy, as well as spread positive information supporting the government's actions. One of the biggest efforts was to slowly spread anti-alien rhetoric, mostly focusing on the still open scars from the Minbari War. By pushing this narrative, Clark was able to increase his approval ratings. The Ministry of Truth would then take these small events and exaggerate them to almost insane levels. Many people knew this but said nothing out of fear. The year of 2260 saw President Clark clamp down harder on the government. Also, events such as the Mars uprisings and attack by what appeared to be hostile aliens in the Sol system was in truth John Sheridan and the White Star destroying a shadow vessel that was out of control gave Clark enough room to declare martial law. With this, he also gave Nightwatch the ability to take control of any military or civilian command or operation. But in the government and military, there were a few who were willing to risk all to expose the truth and stop Clark. One of these was General Haig, a high-ranking and respected officer. Haig knew he had to tread carefully as he began to build his cadre of supporters. Over the last year, he quietly began gathering information and evidence that Clark was involved in President Santiago's murder. Among these was Captain John Sheridan, who was now in command of Babylon 5. Thanks to him and Sheridan's team, Haig was able to gather enough evidence that would have proven Clark's guilt. But sadly, it was too little too late. By the time he was able to expose Clark, he had almost no supporters left in Earthdome to help him. With a failed coup and little support, General Haig and a few Earth Force ships made a fighting retreat from the Sol system and were now on the run. The Earth Alliance civil war had begun, and the cost in lives would be immense. General Haig had escaped Earth with 5 ships, but within a few days, 4 of them had been destroyed, and almost all of his supporters had either been killed or arrested shortly after the failed coup. President Clark's declaration of martial law had increased the already suffocating pressure he had put on civilian organizations such as ISN News and the Belt Alliance. While ISN was forced to obey the new mandates and censorship, the Belt Alliance began to push back by no longer hauling cargo for Earth Force and helping rebels and refugees escape Earth. Such activities were quickly put to an end. The Belt Alliance moved their operations out of the Sol system and, in time, out of the Alliance itself. But the rebels would soon receive another blow. The EAS Alexander was in orbit around the world of Orion 7. General Haig came here to meet with military and planetary leaders, hoping to bring them in to support his rebellion against Clark. While returning to the Alexander, they are ambushed by the EAS Clarkstown. A lucky shot from the Clarkstown kills General Haig. The ship's new commander, Major Ryan, tries to outrun their enemy rather than kill another Earth ship and its crew. But as the damage to the Alexander increases and more crew members are killed and injured, Major Ryan is forced to destroy the Clarkstown. After the battle, with nowhere left to go, the Alexander heads to the only safe spot left, Babylon 5. Only a few days earlier, Captain John Sheridan had put down a takeover attempt by Nightwatch to seize control of the station. This action firmly put him on the side of the rebel forces led by General Haig. The arrival of the Alexander only complicated the issue, as he was now openly helping what many in Earth Gov considered an enemy combatant. This would lead to Clark sending his elite forces to attack and capture Babylon 5 and bring it under his heel. At the same time, President Clark, having had enough of the Mars pushback, ordered bombing attacks on civilian targets. These attacks killed hundreds of innocent people and escalated the crisis. In response, Proxima 3 and Orion 7 declared they were leaving the Alliance until Clark had been removed from power. These actions would have grave consequences later for the planet. As worlds began to succeed from Earth, the Omega destroyer Churchill arrived at Babylon 5 under the command of Captain Sandra Hiroshi. Her arrival brings the news of planets succeeding and of President Clark's forces on their way to take control of the station. All 3 commanders agree to make their stand at Babylon 5 and prepare for a fight. Just before Clark's forces arrive, Captain Sheridan openly declares Babylon 5's succession from Earth. Shortly afterwards, Earth Force arrives. Despite Sheridan's pleas, Earth Force attacks, and a savage battle ensues. The rebels were able to defeat the first task group when a second one jumped in. Thinking it was over, Captain Sheridan was about to order a stand down when Minbari Ambassador Delenn arrived in the White Star and 3 Charlan war cruisers in defense of Babylon 5. The Earth fleet quickly jumped out and the battle was over. The cost was horrific. All Loyalist ships were destroyed, as were several of their fighters. Babylon 5 lost the Churchill and several of their fighters. The loss of life was in the thousands. But now, Babylon 5 was free and able to focus on the coming Shadow War without EarthGov interference. But the war was far from over, and in time both factions would return in open combat. Following the explosive battle at Babylon 5, the Civil War settled into a stalemate. President Clark began to focus on bringing in the rebellious world like Proxima 3 and Orion 7 and crushing the Mars resistant. While rebel Earth Force ships were still on the loose, there were too small in numbers and almost no supply line to replace lost crew or equipment, so they were considered a nominal threat at best. Babylon 5 was now fully involved in the current Shadow War and thus caused almost no problems for him. Plus, Clark's Shadow allies informed him that they would deal with the station in time, and as such, Clark generally steered clear of it. Clark began his campaign to retake the rebel worlds, starting with Mars. While bombing attacks did do some minor damage, the Mars resistance was stubborn and kept fighting back against Earth Force troops. Clark continued to send in more and more troops till they numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Adding to this, Psychor, who was playing both sides to advance their own agenda, supplied loyal telepaths to do scans on anyone deemed a threat of, even if they were remotely connected to any possible individual of interest. These scans were done without the consent of the person being scanned, and there was no area off-limits to them. A simple person could be scanned just for walking down the street, and some telepaths would invade the minds of people involved in personal activities just for their own amusement. But as time passed and the progress was slow, Clark ordered more aggressive and illegal actions, including rounding up family or friends of a wanted person and executing them in hopes of driving them into the open to be arrested or killed. While stubborn, Mars was losing the war and no help was coming soon. On Orion 7, the lightly colonized world was mostly used for food production and some mining with a small population. When they seceded from the Alliance, all they had was a small police force and a local militia to defend themselves with. When an Earth task force arrived in the system, Orion fell in a few short days. Hundreds of people were arrested, and some political and resistance leaders were killed. The people were subject to massive punishments that caused untold suffering to the point of war crimes. Where Orion 7 was not able to protect itself from President Clark's forces, Proxima 3 fared only slightly better. Proxima was a rich colony with a massive industrial base and a large population. They had a few months to prepare for the inevitable attack. That attack came in the form of 6 Omega destroyers. These ships quickly destroyed the orbital defense and laid a full siege on the planet. The attacks began with unrestricted orbital bombardment on both civilian and rebel targets while being careful not to damage any of the valuable mining or industrial site. Clark didn't care about the people. He just wanted to make sure he could still use the planet's industrial infrastructure for his own gain. The attacks lasted for weeks. Then came the ground troop. Tens of thousands of combat veterans landed on the surface and began a reign of terror on the planet's people. Thousands were killed or maimed by these attacks. After the Shadow War, the Shadows left the galaxy. In doing so, Clark lost his most powerful allies. In a panic, he ordered a full blockade of Babylon 5 and began a massive propaganda campaign against the station and its officers. To help sway public opinion further against Sheridan, he ordered Psi-Corp's elite fighter group, the Black Omega Squadron, to attack an Earth Force patrol guarding one of the jump gates leading to Babylon 5. This attack was thwarted by a fighter group sent by the station to stop the attack and save the pilot. This incident would be the first of many small moves President Clark would make to isolate and weaken the rebel forces. Clark, now realizing he was on his own, became more tyrannical and aggressive towards any opposition. His responses would become more violent and deadly. During the Shadow War, Captain John Sheridan was unable to make any efforts to stop Clark from his illegal actions. As the Shadow War escalated to both Vorlon and Shadows began to employ planet-killer weapons, liberating Earth became a lower priority for him. It wasn't till the Vorlons and the other ancient races left the galaxy forever that he could now focus on stopping Clark. Before the war started, the Minbari religious and worker caste constructed a large fleet of new warships called the White Stars. These ships were built to include Vorlon technology and were very fast, extremely agile, and possessed a powerful weapons array. These ships formed the backbone of the Army of Light, manned by an elite group of warriors called Rangers. Minbari Ambassador Delenn was their leader, but gave overall command of the new fleet to Captain Sheridan to fight the Shadows. During the Shadow War, Captain Sheridan was able to bring the League of Non-Aligned Worlds under a united banner to fight the Shadows. This alliance gave him a great deal of influence and understanding of League politics and mindset. Using their paranoia and the weakened state of their military following the war, he was able to convince them to put several White Star attack ships on their borders to protect them from raiders and a race called the Drak, former servants of the Shadows. This alliance would lay the groundwork for the future interstellar alliance. Following the withdrawal of the Shadows, Sheridan began to send agents to Mars to make contact with the Resistance there as well as launch his propaganda campaign called The Voice of the Resistance. This broadcast was able to reach as far as Earth, Minbar, Narn, and even Centauri Prime. Unlike Clark's system, the VOR was anchored by Babylon 5's second-in-command, Susan Ivanova. Through her only the truth was broadcast. Her transmissions gave a beacon of hope to worlds struggling to fight off Clark. Another advantage the rebels had was that B5 became a rally point for rebel Earth Force ship. As ships like the Alexander searched and found other rebel ships, some in bad shape, they were directed and sometimes towed the Babylon 5 for repairs, resupply, and medical aid for their crews. Among these ships were the Explorer-class Cortez, 3 Omega destroyers, 4 Hyperion cruisers, a Nova dreadnought, 2 Hermes transports, and an Avenger carrier, as well as several ships from the Belt Alliance. Sheridan was also able to bring several raider groups to his side by offering them protection and a full pardon after the war, provided they don't harm the crews of any ships they capture and give all cargoes to the rebels. Many raiders walked away, but a few did sign on and would become extremely rich by the war's end, and one group started a legitimate shipping company with an exclusive contract with the Interstellar Alliance. But for now, Sheridan was in no rush to restart another shooting war. As with President Clark, both sides choose to wait the other one out until their next move. As President Clark's embargo against Babylon 5 continued, Captain Sheridan was still searching for a non-violent way to stop him. The embargo was beginning to harm the station in terms of supplies and morale. While the League of Non-Aligned Worlds kept their trade routes open with Babylon 5, it was not enough. Even the smuggled goods from the Belt Alliance and privateers hired by Babylon 5 were failing to provide sufficient food and medical supplies to meet the station's need. To make matters worse, many of Sheridan's allies and contacts in Earth space were either reaching their breaking point or surrendering to end the bloodshed. His head of security, Michael Garibaldi, had resigned shortly after the Shadow War and was quickly becoming a vocal critic of Sheridan's actions. This shift was primarily attributed to Garibaldi being captured and mind-programmed by Psi-Corps to investigate a potential conspiracy against them. The programming would push him further away from the Babylon 5 staff, and he would soon be disconnected from the station altogether. The Mars Rebellion had been crushed and was now little more than a terrorist movement, while the military leadership still mostly supported Clark and followed his orders, whether they were legal or illegal. Things took a turn for the worse when Sheridan and his staff learned that Earth ships were openly firing on civilian vessels without warning or provocation. The most horrific incident occurred at Proxima 3, where a fleet of 6 Omega destroyers commanded by Captain Trevor Hall, a staunch supporter of Clark, had been authorized to do whatever was necessary to bring Proxima 3 to heel. In one of the greatest war crimes of the Civil War, the destroyers Heracles and Pollux shot down 2 civilian transports carrying 10,000 refugees. Each ship was destroyed just as it reached the jump gate. This event was the final straw for Sheridan. It was time to act and put an end to Clark's rampage. He ordered the entire White Star fleet to assemble at Babylon 5 and reactivated the station's war room. Calling an emergency meeting of all the races on the station, Sheridan was ready to cash in the IOU he had with the League for putting the White Stars on their borders to protect their shipping. He shared his plan to confront Clark and declared that any treaties with Earth were null and void. The Narn were the first to openly support this action, quickly followed by the League and the Centauri. With their backing, he was ready to launch a campaign to liberate Earth. The first step was to gather as much information as possible about the fleet blocking Proxima and to identify which ships were avoiding fire on civilian targets. This intelligence led to the identification of the ships EAS Heracles, Furies, Vesta, Juno, Pollux, and Nemesis, along with their respective captains. The second step involved deploying groups of white stars to conduct close flybys of several Earth worlds and outposts, including Earth itself, to prevent reinforcements from reaching the Proxima task force. The third step was a gradual buildup of the white stars in hyperspace near Proxima 3 while maintaining contact with the Proxima resistance. The final step was for Sheridan to join the advanced elements with 2 squadrons of Starfreeze in support. The White Star fleet would face off against the Earth Force fleet for the first time in a battle that was all or nothing. If Sheridan won, Proxima would be liberated, delivering a significant blow to Earth Force morale. However, if he failed, the rebellion could be crushed, and Clark would have defeated his greatest rival. Proxima 3 has always been the crown jewel of the Earth Alliance, thanks to its vast mineral deposits and robust industrial base that have made its people prosperous and independent-minded. When the planet announced its secession from the Alliance, President Clark prioritized bringing it back under his control, as the manufacturing and shipbuilding facilities were essential to his power base. To this end, Clark sent Captain Trevor Hall to lead a task force of 6 Omega-class destroyers to recapture the planet. Within a year, the death toll had reached the tens of thousands, and the residents were running out of food, medical supplies, and hope. Captain Sheridan planned to give the destroyer group a choice: leave the planet peacefully, surrender, or, if necessary, be forcibly removed. He knew the Heracles and Pollux were hostile, but he was uncertain about the other 4 ships. He hoped they would depart peacefully and one or more would join him in his fight against Clark. The first stage of his strategy was to send 3 white stars behind the planet to draw away the Heracles and Pollux. This would allow him to focus on engaging those 2 ships, minimizing casualties and unnecessary escalation. Captain Hall dispatched the Pollux and the Nemesis to investigate the unidentified vessels when the White Stars arrived. Minutes later, a larger group of White Stars jumped in front of the task force, prompting them to focus on this new threat. Captain Hall recognized the ships as belonging to Captain Sheridan and ordered the Vesta and Furies to engage the second group. Soon after, Sheridan arrived with his main force of White Stars and Starfreeze. While presenting the Earth Destroyer group with their options, Sheridan received a call from Captain Edward MacDougan of the Vesta. As MacDougan reminded him of the illegality of their mission at Proxima, Captain Hall ordered his ships to open fire on Sheridan's forces. The battle quickly became chaotic, with fighters engaging one another while the White Stars attacked the Omegas. Many Omegas stayed back, limiting their actions to self-defense. This forced Sheridan to break from the leading attack group and contact each ship to assess their status in the fight. The Furies and Vesta stood down, declaring themselves non-hostile. The Nemesis sustained heavy damage and eventually surrendered. The Juno withdrew from the battle and left the system, while the Pollux was destroyed by an out-of-control White Star, losing both crews. Captain Sheridan then contacted the Heracles and ordered them to surrender. Captain Hall lost his nerve and was relieved of command by his executive officer, Commander Sandra Levitt, who subsequently surrendered and ordered all forces in the system to stand down. Afterward, 1 Omega remained behind at Proxima to defend the planet, 2 more joined Sheridan's side, including Captain MacDougan, and a 4th withdrew from the war altogether. Sheridan began planning the next move as the rebel ships assembled at Proxima 3. During this confrontation, he had the element of surprise. Now Clark knew Sheridan was on the offensive. The Battle of Proxima was costly for both sides, with thousands killed, marking only the beginning of the conflict. But more bloodier battles lay ahead, and Clark was far from defeated. Earth Force's loss at Proxima 3 was a significant blow to Clark. Although he tried to conceal the defeat, Captain Sheridan's propaganda machine, known as the Voice of the Resistance, broadcast the news throughout the galaxy. The defeat was even more devastating because Sheridan managed to convince 2 Earth destroyers to join him in his cause. However, Sheridan now faced some new dilemmas. The first challenge was the need to protect Babylon 5 while liberating other worlds from Clark's forces. To ensure the security of his rear flanks, he requested that every League race commit at least 1 medium or larger warship to defend Babylon 5. This request was a condition for placing the White Star Fleet on their borders to protect them from raiders. The second concern for Sheridan was that now Clark was aware of the renewed hostilities. He had lost the element of surprise. Consequently, Earth Force began to reinforce their bases and outposts in preparation for Sheridan's next move. President Clark began claiming that Sheridan was under the control of the Minbari, who were using him to finish what they had started years before: the extermination of the human race. He backed up his claims by stating that the White Star ships were crewed by Minbari and pointed to his engagement with Minbari Ambassador Delenn as evidence. As many still remembered the horrors of the Minbari War, it was easy for Clark to garner public and military support against Sheridan. Captain Sheridan anticipated that Clark would use this tactic and countered by utilizing only the White Star Fleet with human commanders. While he had a massive support fleet consisting of Major and League race ships backing him, bringing these forces into battle could diminish his public support and make his fight appear more like a mission of conquest rather than liberation. Therefore, he had to be cautious about what he deployed to each engagement. Sheridan was eager to reach Mars as soon as possible, but he knew that several military bases and thousands of ships and fighters lay between him and Mars. While he could navigate to the Sol system and liberate Mars and Earth, such a battle would be a bloodbath, requiring him to deploy all of his forces and allied ship. This tactic would likely cost him support and expose his flanks to Earth's counterattacks, ruining diplomatic relations between Earth and other worlds for decades. As a result, Sheridan decided to focus on liberating Beta Durrani from Clark's rule. This planet was one of the first to declare independence from Earth following the Mars bombings. It had minimal defensive capabilities and fell quickly to occupation. For nearly a year, the planet endured forced occupation, with hundreds of inhabitants rounded up, tortured, imprisoned, and even killed. The force guarding Beta Durrani consisted of a powerful fleet of 41 warships, 12 of which were Omega destroyers commanded by officers loyal to Clark. The fleet had been extensively briefed on Proxima and the White Stars and was heavily reinforced, simply waiting for Sheridan to make his move. When Sheridan finally entered the system, he advanced rapidly against the Earth ships. Upon reaching firing range, he once again offered the fleet the opportunity to withdraw or surrender. The Earth Force captains who had joined Sheridan from Proxima could pursue nearly half the Earth ships, switch allegiances, and join Sheridan. However, despite this unexpected loss of ships, the remaining loyal forces fought fiercely against Sheridan. They opened fire, leading to a chaotic battle with heavy casualties. One ship, the Nova-class vessel Hayden, was crewed by Clark fanatics and chose to fight until the end. They pushed its weapons array beyond safe limits by force, charging directly from the ship's main reactor, bypassing numerous safety measures. This reckless decision resulted in the reactor exploding and destroying the vessel, along with all hands on board. 3 Omega destroyers attempted to corner Sheridan's White Star and concentrate their fire on him. Their tactic might have succeeded if not for a White Star commander who realized their plan and heroically rammed the lead Omega, destroying it and giving Sheridan a chance to escape the onslaught. As the battle turned against Earth Force, 2 Hyperion cruisers made a panicked jump into hyperspace. However, since they opened the jump points almost directly on top of each other, the massive energy released from the resulting explosions destroyed both ships and many retreating fighters. The blast also took out 6 White Stars. In the end, Beta Durrani was liberated in under 5 hours, and Sheridan gained support from nearly a dozen new Earth ships. However, the cost was significant. Sheridan lost almost half of all his fighter support from Babylon 5 and became reliant on the fighters from his supporting Earth ships moving forward. He also lost several White Stars in the battle. Once it was safe, several Belt Alliance ships entered the system, delivering much-needed food and medical supplies. As Sheridan continued his crusade to liberate the Earth Alliance, his number of Earth ships grew, but the cost of each battle increased with every engagement. Little did Sheridan know that President Clark still had a few aces up his sleeve and was preparing to use them. Following the liberation of Beta Durrani, Sheridan took stock of his forces. He had gained a large number of Earth ships but lost a large number of White Stars and Starfrees in the process. Since the Minbari had not produced any new White Stars since the Vorlons left the galaxy, he had to use them sparingly. He also didn't want to commit his Earth ships to battle as they would be needed when he tackled Earth itself. For now, he had the rebel Earth ships stay behind to protect liberated worlds from reprisals from Clark. With the colony worlds secure, Sheridan had more latitude when it came to planning his next move. The liberation of Proxima and Beta Durrani required swift action before Clark's forces killed any more innocent lives. After that, the only planet in danger was Mars, but Sheridan knew that he could not yet move against Earth's home system. They still had several military outposts and mid-range bases that had to be neutralized before moving forward. Sheridan prefaced his next serious move with a series of feints and false attacks against each of the Earth Force outposts he needed to take out. Taking full advantage of the White Star's exceptional speed and maneuverability, Sheridan harassed the Earth outpost for several days before making any serious move. The White Stars would jump into a system, make a long-range flyby of their defense, and then flee before the Earth ships could respond. These flybys gave Sheridan valuable intelligence about the disposition of their assets and also put the Earth Force commanders on edge. In one case, 6 false raids took place in 24 hours. Earth commanders would have to scramble fighters, go to red alert, and get everyone up about a potential battle. Then, the White Stars would be gone long before any shots could be taken. President Clark's orders not to pursue the enemy into hyperspace also frustrated Earth Force commanders. Their main objective was to defend their bases. Clark was preparing an offensive of his own and needed these bases intact, as well as bolstering his defenses at home. He would need these bases to attack Babylon 5. As the false raids continued, Sheridan began to move his forces into position. The raids were having the desired effect. After countless false alarms, Earth Force reflexes were starting to dull and become complacent. Many began to believe that the real attack would never come, even though there was still a real chance of it happening. On the last day of the raids, 38 minutes after the previous flyby, Sheridan attacked 4 bases simultaneously. Most of the Earth fighters had landed and were in the process of refueling when Sheridan attacked. 2 small bases fell quickly when the defending fleet forces retreated. The base commanders surrendered without any shots being fired. The other 2 bases were Orion 7 and Deneb 4. Orion was well fortified with an Orion-class space station and 37 warship. While most of their fighters were refueling, the base commanders still chose to fight. Realizing the battle was lost, nearly a full third of the defending fleet changed sides before combat. Half the remaining ships jumped out and ran, leaving only 3 Omegas and 4 Novas to fight. This battle was still no cakewalk. The fleet commander was a Minbari War veteran who saw Sheridan as a Minbari sympathizer and true traitor to the human race, so she stood her ground. Charging her fleet into Sheridan's forces, 2 of the Omegas and all 4 Novas were destroyed. The final Omega, the fleet commander's flagship, rammed the Orion station when the station commander offered to surrender, killing both. The battle for Deneb was much easier. Most of the Earth ships retreated, and local resistance fighters quickly overwhelmed the few ground forces on the planet. The garrison commander would later be tried and convicted by a military tribunal for war crimes and executed 2 years later. As with early battles, Sheridan gained more Earth ships and cleared the way to move deeper into Earth space. President Clark was now getting paranoid that his military commanders were plotting against him, and he soon took direct control of all military forces. But now was the time for Clark to strike back at Sheridan, planning a surprise attack that might help him turn the tide of the war. President Clark could only seethe as he read the follow-up reports about the defeats at Orion and Deneb. He had lost 2 more major bases and suffered more ship losses to defections than in combat. To make matters worse, veteran captains who commanded many of these vessels had years of experience. These losses could not be replaced, and those captains were now convincing other ships to change sides, thus strengthening Sheridan's forces. They provided valuable information, such as ship deployments and codes, which increased public support for Sheridan among the populace. Clark needed to turn things around quickly to win the war. After weeks of planning, the Earth Force leadership devised a strategy similar to Sheridan's tactic against the Black Star during the Earth-Minbari War. They would send a small task group to Proxima 3, issue a false distress call, and lure some of the White Star fleet into an ambush. The ship chosen for this mission was the EAS Lysander, an Omega destroyer. The Lysander had faced Sheridan's forces twice in combat, but had to retreat due to being outnumbered and outmaneuvered. The Lysander's captain, Frank Reagan, supported Clark and had previously commanded the Hyperion-class cruiser Hamilton when his task force arrived at Babylon 5 a year prior, too late to assist Captain Smith of the Roanoke when his task force was destroyed. Driven away by Minbari warships led by the Minbari ambassador Delenn, Reagan developed a deep-seated hatred for Sheridan and the Minbari. The plan was surprisingly simple. The Lysander would undergo a cosmetic makeover to appear damaged. This included pyrotechnic sparkers and gas cylinders to simulate heavy damage and venting atmosphere from hull breaches. In support of the Lysander were the Avenger-class carriers Cobalt and Shohu. Both ships would be equipped with upgraded weapons and a full complement of fighters, 48 fighters each, in addition to the 24 Thunderbolts the Lysander would carry. Once they arrived in the Proxima system, the carriers would power down behind one of the small moons and maintain radio silence as the Lysander sent out its distress call. Once enemy ships got close enough, the Lysander would open fire, and the Avengers would launch their fighters to overwhelm them. Captain Reagan understood that this could be a suicide mission and ensured his ship was crewed by loyal officers who would not hesitate in executing the plan. The small fleet jumped into the Proxima system. They slowly moved to the outermost planet and took their positions. When ready, the Lysander sent out its distress call. Within hours, Reagan detected 6 ships approaching. By their speed, he recognized they were White Stars. Captain Reagan ordered his gunners to wait until the White Stars were at point-blank range before opening fire. At this point, it is essential to understand that Minbari-trained Rangers commanded the White Stars. Their training had been conducted under Minbari tactics, and most trainers were either religious or worker caste instructors who had never fought in battle. Any military knowledge they had came from old recordings of previous battles or texts hundreds of years old. Tactics involving deception or trickery were nearly unheard of in Minbari warfare, and few had ever received training in Earth Force tactics or combat philosophy. Therefore, when they received the Lysander's distress call, they quickly made their way to assist. On the Lysander, Captain Reagan continued his pleas for help, relying on the Rangers' compassion and naivety. He signaled the carriers to prepare for combat. The Lysander opened fire with all its weapons when the White Stars reached point-blank range. The initial volley destroyed 2 White Stars and caused the others to scatter. Just then, the 96 Starfaries from the carriers surged in to swarm the enemy. They aimed to isolate the White Stars and prevent them from supporting each other. The Lysander's fighters soon joined the battle, with the Avengers maintaining a safe distance and firing at the White Stars to keep them from coordinating their efforts. Although the Starfreeze weapons did little more than dent the White Stars' hulls, the Thunderbolt's heavy cannons caused significant damage. A third White Star was lost when another salvo from the Lysander hit it, finishing it off with missiles fired from 4 Thunderbolts. At this point, the remaining White Stars panicked and fled. A fourth White Star was damaged by the pulse cannons of the Avengers and finished off by the Lysander. The last 2 managed to make quick jumps into hyperspace and escape. Once the fighting concluded, Captain Reagan collected several pieces of White Star debris and spent hours recording video and taking photographs. These images showed dead Minbari crews, proving that the Minbari were responsible for the war and that Sheridan was an unwilling pawn. The 3 ships then gathered their remaining fighters and left the system. While the battle was a victory for Earth Force, it came at a cost. The Lysander took heavy damage, and most of the fighters were destroyed. Nearly 200 officers were killed or wounded. But for Clark, the battle was a major victory. He put the footage of the White Stars and their Minbari crews on ISN to show that the Minbari were behind the war and that Sheridan was their puppet, using him to finish what they started 14 years before: the destruction of the Alliance and enslavement of its people. This had the desired effect of turning the population against Sheridan and supporting Clark. The second trick was to tell Earth Force personnel only that the crews of all the Earth ships that defected or surrendered were killed and replaced by Minbari crews. Thus, Sheridan's promise of safety was a lie. While many in Earth Force did not support Clark, they were damned if they were going to let the Minbari conquer Earth or her people. For Sheridan, this battle would have long-lasting effects. His most significant advantage was convincing other Earth ships to defect to his side. Now, this method would end up costing him dearly in the subsequent battles. As Sheridan liberated Alliance worlds from Clark's forces, other elements on Mars conspired against him. They didn't necessarily support President Clark. Rather, they were fearful of the growing power of the Psi Corps. One of these individuals was William Edgars, the owner and CEO of Edgars Industries, the 4th largest megacorporation in the Earth Alliance. Although the corporation was publicly marketed as a pharmaceutical company, it also invested in genetic and biological weapons. During the Shadow War, B5's head of security, Michael Garibaldi, was captured by a shadow vessel and, through unknown means, ended up imprisoned by Psi Corps operative Alfred Bester. Bester was an agent with little moral conscience who believed telepaths were superior to normal humans and should rule over them. Paranoia about its survival made Psi Corps aware that elements used the Civil War to plot its downfall, but all leads proved fruitless. Bester planned to modify Garibaldi's mind and use him to identify and eliminate the conspirators. However, knowing that Sheridan and others would thwart such a plan, they isolated and alienated Garibaldi from his friends, deeming him persona non grata on Babylon 5. Once the mental programming was completed, Psi Corps leaked information about Garibaldi's location, leading to his prompt rescue by Babylon 5 forces. Garibaldi and Sheridan immediately began to clash over strategies to combat the Shadow War. After the war concluded and the first ones departed the galaxy, Garibaldi resigned from his post and transitioned to a role as a private investigator at the station. During the interval between wars, Garibaldi continued to criticize Sheridan while secretly being contacted by William Edgars to assist him in smuggling illegal items through the station and bypassing security. One of these jobs involved Garibaldi's ex-lover, Lise Hampton, who was now Edgars' wife. After months of working for Edgars, Garibaldi eventually left the station for Mars. Edgars had arranged for him to travel safely to the planet and work as his personal security expert. Captain Sheridan's counterattack against Clark was unexpectedly swift, and Edgars wasn't fully prepared to enact his plan. To buy time, Sheridan had to be stopped before he made his way to Earth. To this end, Edgar chooses to hand Sheridan over to Clark, thus slowing down the war and giving him precious time to enact his plans. Garibaldi's first assignment was to locate Sheridan's father, David Sheridan, a respected former ambassador and diplomat who suffered from a rare blood disease that required specific medication. David had to go into hiding quickly, leaving little time to gather the necessary supplies. Using Edgar's company resources, Garibaldi was able to track down the medication for Sheridan's father, and he was soon captured. One of David's capture conditions was that he would not be harmed. With this accomplished, the second part of the plan commenced. Garibaldi contacted John Sheridan and informed him of his father's arrest, mentioning that he was on Mars, preparing to be transferred back to Earth. Unaware that Garibaldi was laying a trap, Sheridan traveled to Mars to meet Garibaldi at a local bar. After being tranquilized, Sheridan was handed over to Earth Force, where he endured days of beatings and torture. Edgars was convinced he could trust Garibaldi and revealed his plan to control telepaths and bring down Clark. He had successfully mapped the genome responsible for telepathic abilities and created a virus that would kill a telepath within a week without harming a normal human. Additionally, he developed a treatment for the virus that necessitated weekly injections for telepaths if they wished to survive. The virus could be released through air, food, or injections, ensuring maximum exposure. Once Psi-Corps was no longer a threat, Edgars and his associates would eliminate Clark and his followers and seize government control. Now that Garibaldi had all the information he needed, the Psi-Corps programming took over. He arranged a clandestine meeting with Bester. After reading Garibaldi's mind, Bester bragged about what would happen and even taunted him about his current zombie-like state for amusement. Ultimately, Bester sent a telepathic signal to release Garibaldi from the programming and left him alone. Rage boiled over in Garibaldi once he realized he had been used to betray his friends. His first act was to return to Edgar's home to rescue Lise. However, he found only the dead Edgars and a mortally wounded aide. He quickly sent messages to Babylon 5 and Ivanova for help. Unfortunately, at that point, the ISN network had already broadcasted Sheridan's capture and praised Garibaldi's involvement, but there was no response. Ivanova even issued orders that if Garibaldi showed up at the station, he was to be shot on sight, no questions asked. When Garibaldi couldn't find any trace of Lise and received no responses to his messages, he decided to head to the Mars Resistance. They were preparing for the final phase of Sheridan's plan to liberate Mars and Earth. Also present on Mars were Stephen Franklin, the head of medicine at Babylon 5, and Lyda Alexander, a rogue telepath modified by the Vorlons. Both had once been close friends of Garibaldi, but their trust in him had worn thin. Upon his arrival at the Resistance base, the leader gave Franklin and Lyda the option to kill him as revenge for his earlier betrayal. In a moment of utter desperation, Garibaldi begged Lyda to scan him. The scan was difficult because Bester had imposed several powerful blocks to prevent such an intrusion. Despite the risk of causing permanent brain damage, she proceeded and uncovered the truth. Once they were convinced of his loyalty, Garibaldi quickly devised a plan to rescue Sheridan and bring him back to Babylon 5. The plan succeeded, allowing him to return to the rebel fleet just in time to help finish the war. Garibaldi understood he had much to make up for, and now was his opportunity to prove he was still the loyal, unconventional friend he had always been. Captain Sheridan's next major objective was to liberate Tau Ceti IV from President Clark. Tau Ceti was an industrial world, renowned for its first-class shipyard and military manufacturing center. Even after learning about the defeat of the White Stars by the Lysander, Sheridan remained convinced that he could persuade other Earthships to defect to his side. However, he was unaware that Clark was already disseminating false information to Earth Force military personnel, claiming that the crews of captured or defected ships were being killed and replaced by Minbari crews. This deception was heavily promoted by the Night Watch, and video footage of the wrecked White Stars alongside the bodies of Minbari crews only reinforced these beliefs. Even military personnel who did not support President Clark were unwilling to allow Earth to fall to a despised enemy like the Minbari. To defend Tau Ceti, Earth Force deployed a large task force comprising 16 Omegas, 12 Hyperions, 9 Novas, nearly 400 fighters, an Orion starbase, several heavy defense satellites, and an extensive minefield. Since Proxima, the ISN network had been inundating the news with reports of Sheridan leading an alien conquest of Earth and planning to rule humanity as a pawn of the Minbari. Sheridan needed to prove that this was not an alien invasion of the Earth Alliance but a liberation from tyranny. To do so, he made the difficult decision to commit his limited Earth warships to lead the charge alongside the White Star fleet. The plan was straightforward. Sheridan's forces would jump into the system from 3 sides to corner the Earth fleet against Tau Ceti. Trapped and unable to maneuver, he would offer them a chance to defect, surrender, or withdraw. Confident in his strategy, Sheridan believed this would be a short battle with minimal loss of life. Unfortunately, he was mistaken. The fleet defending Tau Ceti fully believed Clark's lies and was prepared to fight to the end. As soon as Sheridan's forces entered the system, the Earth forces opened fire without warning. There was no opportunity to communicate or organize a defensive strategy. Within minutes, 3 of Sheridan's Omegas were heavily damaged, and dozens of fighters were destroyed. The Tau Ceti fleet then charged Sheridan's forces, pushing them back in a sudden turn of events. Several White Stars were lost before Sheridan ordered a full retreat. Despite their withdrawal, the Earth fleet continued to fire, destroying an Omega and 3 Novas. Visibly shaken during hyperspace travel, Sheridan realized the intensity with which the Earth force fought. However, he couldn't abandon Tau Ceti to Clark. After reorganizing his forces, he jumped back into the system at a safer distance and prepared for another engagement. This time, he instructed the White Stars to split into 2 flanking groups while the Earth ships advanced down the center. The new plan was to use his Earth ships to pin the enemy while the White Stars executed fast attack runs on the flank. The Orion station and defense satellites complicated this strategy, as they provided intense cover fire and limited maneuvering room due to the minefield. After approximately 9 hours of combat, the remaining Earth fleet was severely damaged and unable to escape. Worse, several Earth fighters began making suicide runs against the rebel ship. Finally, Sheridan caught a break. After ordering the remaining Earth ships to surrender, 1 Omega captain responded, revealing the propaganda Clark had fed them about crews being killed and replaced. Fortunately, Captain MacDougan of the Vista convinced the remaining Earth ships to stand down. The battle was over, but the cost was staggering. Sheridan had lost 14 White Stars and 26 Earth ships, 7 Omegas, 3 Novas, 5 Hyperions, 2 Hermes, 3 Condor supply ships, 1 Avenger, 3 small Myrmidon gunboats, and nearly 250 fighters. The loss of life exceeded 12,000, and several more Earth ships and White Stars were so heavily damaged that they had to remain behind in Tau Ceti for repairs. Earth Force suffered even greater losses. All but 4 Omegas were destroyed, along with 10 Hyperions, 8 Novas, the Orion starbase, and 370 fighters. Crew deaths exceeded 20,000, making this battle one of the bloodiest since the Earth-Minbari War. Sheridan had lost almost half of his Earth ships and their respective fighter groups in this conflict. Clark's lies would complicate and intensify the struggle going forward. From this moment on, Sheridan could no longer rely on tactics of persuasion to convince ships to defect or withdraw. The Earth force would stand their ground and fight to the end, something Sheridan had desperately wanted to prevent. Back at Earth Dome, President Clark's feelings about Tau Ceti IV were mixed. He was pleased that the Earth fleet had fought Sheridan to a standstill for hours and inflicted heavy losses on his forces. However, He was also upset that he had lost another significant industrial world to Sheridan. But Clark wasn't finished yet. He still had a few tricks up his sleeve, and the time was nearly right to play his final ace. With the fall of Tau Ceti IV, many Earth ships were cut off and trapped behind enemy lines. Most of these ships went to Arisia, a new colony with limited support facilities or resources. Arisia had almost 300 warships, dozens of cargo ships, and troop transports carrying tens of thousands of ground troop. Clark had a large military force in a completely useless location. President Clark ordered these ships to run a gauntlet of enemy ships and make their way to Earth-controlled space. At the same time, 2 Earth ships, the Menelaos, an Omega, and the Cyrus, a Nova, had chosen to defect to the rebels. Both ships faked distress calls about being attacked and began to run silent. Earth Force Command assumed both ships were lost, allowing them to sneak across the lines and link up with Sheridan. Their arrival also gave Sheridan the information about the fleet at Arisia being ordered to break through enemy lines and rejoin the main fleet. Sheridan knew he couldn't let these ships link up and devised a bold plan to cut them off and neutralize them. Since he hadn't yet announced the defections of the 2 Earth ships, which he does regularly to show his support, he decided to use them as bait for an ambush. Sheridan would send the Menelaos and Cryas out and have them send out yet another distress call saying they survived the attack, but were severely damaged and needed help to offload their wounded. When the Earth Force fleet jumped out to assist, Sheridan would jump around the fleet and surround them. The only real dilemma Sheridan had was with the troop transports. These ships were generally lightly armed or armored, carrying over 4,000 troops each. He would attack defenseless ships and kill helpless people. So, he decided to limit their engagements to minimal damage only, primarily focusing on engines and weapons. All other support ships would be targeted as needed with limited force as needed. Once everyone was in position, the 2 ships sent out their distress call. About 2 hours later, the Earth fleet jumped in and made its way to assist the 2 helpless vessels. Just as they reached them, Sheridan and his forces jumped in and surrounded them. Before any transmission could be sent, the Earth fleet opened fire. The first salvo destroyed the Melianos and Cyrus in seconds. Then, the fleet began breaking into small groups to fight out of the trap. Starfaries were making wild and desperate attacks on White Stars and Rebel ship. The battle became more chaotic when both fleets merged into massive furballs. Many ships fired on friendly ships, and White Stars could not maneuver in such confined spaces. Even worse, many troop transports were firing into the battle, hitting friend and foe alike. Starfaries made several strafing runs on them, but had to limit their attacks to avoid destroying the vessels and killing the troops on board. Some Earth ships got so desperate to escape that they began to charge the lines and hope to break out. Many of them ended up disabled or destroyed by enemy fire, while others accidentally and, on a few occasions, intentionally rammed ships to at least take an enemy ship with them. A few ships tried to jump out, but one ship accidentally opened a jump point inside another. The powerful explosion destroyed dozens of ships and damaged hundreds of others. When the battle was finally over, Sheridan had won, but the cost nearly crippled him. He had prevented the Earth warships from rejoining the Earth Force, but most were destroyed. Thousands of lives were lost on both sides, and the troop transports were able to make their way back to Earth-controlled space. For him, he lost nearly 20 White Stars, 51 Earth ships, hundreds of fighters, and thousands of crew members. While Clark was enraged about the defeat, his generals confirmed that Sheridan's forces had also been badly weakened and that nearly 200,000 ground troops were on their way to defend Earth if needed. Shortly after the battle, as the rebel forces reorganized and repaired their ships, the Omega destroyer Agamemnon, Sheridan's last command, arrived to join his crusade to liberate Earth. A little while later, Sheridan received a message from Michael Garibaldi informing him of his father's arrest and requesting that Sheridan come to Mars to help rescue him. This was a trap to capture Sheridan and slow his progress against Clark so Morgan Edgars could enact his anti-telepath plan. Before leaving for Mars, Sheridan had Commander Susan Ivanova take command of the fleet and continue their drive toward Earth. The war was now at a crossroad. With Sheridan imprisoned and the rebel fleet leaderless, Clark now prepared to destroy the remaining rebel Earth ship. For this, he would unleash his final ace against them. While Captain Sheridan was heading to Mars to rescue his father, Commander Susan Ivanova and the rest of the rebel forces were scouring Earth space, looking for holdouts and neutralizing any remaining Loyalist ship. This endeavor led to numerous small battles all over the Alliance. After weeks of searching, it was time to bring their forces together and regroup for the final stage of the war, liberating Earth herself. The location of the rendezvous was Sector 300, about 2 light-years from the Sol system. Most Earth ships still able to fight made their way to Tau Ceti 4 for quick repairs and resupply. Some remained with the main force, including the leading group of White Stars. It would be known that not all ships that joined Sheridan were very loyal to his cause. Some joined, hoping to escape any real punishment for any crimes the crew may have been involved in. By leaking information to Clark, they also hoped to play both sides, no matter who wins. One of the key pieces of information they sent was the time and location of the fleet regrouping point. For Clark, this was his real last chance to end the rebellion. Clark would commit his last ace to achieve this goal, a task force of elite ships he had held back for such a situation. He knew when and where to send the vessels with one specific order: destroy as many Earth Force ships as possible. While Clark was planning for his ambush, Commander Ivanova had just finished defeating a large Earth task force, was supervising the collection of escape pods, and was planning the next step when she learned from one of the new prisoners that President Clark knew the location of the rendezvous point and was preparing an ambush. The prisoner only knew that the ships being sent were a new type of advanced vessel. After conferring with other Earth Force captains, Commander Ivanova ordered all available White Stars to Sector 300 ahead of the slower Earth ships, which had chosen to regroup at their current location before heading to Sector 300 to join Ivanova's White Stars. The hope was that she could counter the ambush and clear the area for the other rebel ships before they arrive. Upon arriving at the coordinates, Commander Ivanova ordered the White Stars to jump into real space and began to scan the area. As she did, several jump points opened around the fleet. What emerged shocked them to their core. The ships were Omega destroyers covered with shadow vessel skin armor and armed with shadow weapons. These vessels could have easily devastated the rebel Earth ships within minutes. By doing this, the rebels would be seen only as alien troublemakers and not an actual rebellion. Ivanova acted fast. She ordered the White Stars to attack the Omegas. The destroyers' new shadow armor allowed them to shake off hits that would have commonly caused severe damage. And their new weapons had greater range and punch than the standard Omegas. The enemy fleet comprised the 10 ships that launched their fighters and tried to surround the White Stars. Commander Ivanova ordered the White Stars to form up and used her ship's speed and maneuverability to outpace the Omegas. Then, she had them break into small groups and make hit-and-run sting attacks to wear down the enemy ship's armor. The tactic worked, and soon, most of the Omegas were destroyed. A couple tried to escape, but the overwhelming number of White Stars was too much for them. As the final Omega tried to jump out, Ivanova bore down on it with almost suicidal determination. As the Omega exploded, her White Star flew through the explosion and was hit by an extensive wreckage. The damage was critical, and Ivanova herself was severely injured and was carried to an escape pod just before the vessel exploded. While the battle was won, the cost was significant. All 10 Omegas were destroyed with all hands, and over 24 White Stars were also lost. Commander Ivanova's injuries forced her to retire from the field, and be sent back to Babylon 5. But there was some good news. Sheridan had been rescued and returned to the rebel fleet. Now, Sheridan was ready to finish the war. At the request of Commander Avon Ava, he would lead the attack from his flagship, the Agamemnon. But Clark still had enough ships to make the battle difficult. But Sheridan had his aces, too, and was about to use them to save thousands of lives. After Sheridan's rescue, he quickly reunited with his commanders and returned to the rebel forces. At the request of Commander Susan Avonava, he took command of the Agamemnon as his flagship. He began planning the final stage of the liberation of Earth, aiming to take down President Clark. This task would be particularly challenging, as all Loyalist ships had no place to retreat and were determined to stand their ground until the end. It was a tragic repeat of the Battle of the Line from the Minbari War 13 years earlier. Earth Force would throw everything it could into stopping him. Everyone understood that Mars was the key to the Earth system. Although Earth was the main target, Mars had a substantial contingent of troops and ships protecting it. If Sheridan bypassed Mars, the Earth's defense grid could hold his forces at bay while the fleet at Mars attacked his flank. Therefore, Sheridan needed to neutralize the forces there before he could advance on Earth. However, Sheridan had one more major ace up his sleeve. During the Shadow War, he had captured a transport ship carrying hundreds of rogue telepaths in stasis. The Shadows had them implanted with advanced cybernetics, forcing them to serve as pilots for shadow vessels. When one of the telepaths awoke, she immediately attempted to merge with Babylon 5's computer, causing many of the station's systems to malfunction. Despite the station's medical staff's best efforts to save them, they needed resources from Earth to help, if possible. While Sheridan was making plans, Dr. Franklin and Lyda Alexander were en route to Mars, bringing 30 telepaths to use against Earth's fleet in Mars orbit. The Resistance leader was not pleased with the idea of using the telepaths as weapons, but by sacrificing these 30, Sheridan hoped to save 30,000 crew members. Meanwhile, Michael Garibaldi was leading teams to secure the outer perimeter of one of Mars's large military bases, aiming to weaken the Mars defense grid. As the telepaths were smuggled onto the Omega destroyers, several white stars conducted rapid reconnaissance of the outer planets, revealing them stripped of military defenses and posing no threat. Most surrendered to Sheridan even before the white stars jumped into the system. However, Mars and Earth had been fortified, prepared for the final assault. Mars had 36 Omega destroyers in high orbit, waiting for Sheridan to make his next move. These ships were among the most loyal to Clark. The rest had either surrendered or been cut off from Earth and trapped. General Robert Lefcourt, another veteran of the Minbari War, commanded the fleet and knew the upcoming battle would be an all-or-nothing fight. He did his best to bolster the fleet's morale. Unbeknownst to General Lefcourt, Sheridan's plan was already in motion. Once Garibaldi secured the perimeter outposts, Lyda Alexander contacted the telepaths aboard the Omegas and awakened them. At the same time, a white star made a dangerous atmospheric jump over the Mars base and attacked. Lefcourt recognized this as a diversion, instructing the fleet to maintain formation. Then, Sheridan made his jump. As he entered, the telepaths merged with the Omega's computers, causing chaos. Systems failed, communications were lost, and the ship's engines lost power. Suddenly, 30 of the 36 Omegas were disabled without a single shot fired. The white stars quickly went to work, neutralizing the remaining Omegas. With this task complete, the fleet jumped to hyperspace to end the war once and for all. Most League ships stayed behind to monitor the Earth vessels in case they encountered trouble. At 1:45 a.m. Earth Standard Time, Captain John Sheridan and the fleet arrived in Earth orbit. Every rebel Earth ship positioned itself around Earth, while the other races held back. Sheridan then addressed the people of Earth, stating that they had come to place President Clark under arrest and return the government to the people. As he spoke, resistance fighters, political leaders in hiding, and even average citizens across the globe began to rise and fight back. Meanwhile, utterly defeated and consumed by rage, Clark activated the orbital defense network against Earth. Determined to bring destruction with him if he were going down, President Morgan Clark, dictator, murderer, terrorist, and war criminal, took his own life just as the doors to his office were forced open. When word of his death reached Sheridan, he ordered all ships, regardless of origin, to destroy the satellites. Hundreds of ships and fighters united to take down the satellite. Several ships were lost, including some of those from the Mars fleet that could address the telepath issue. With the defense grid destroyed, the war was over. All remaining Loyalist ships stood down. However, Earth now faced a crossroads. They had to grapple with the aftermath of the war and the war crimes that had been committed. Sheridan himself would need to face an inquiry for his actions. The long process of rebuilding had begun. Following the destruction of the Earth defense grid and the death of President Clark, Captain John Sheridan surrendered himself to the Earth Force's authorities. With him were several other ship captains and a delegation from the major races and League worlds. All non-Earth vessels moved out of the Sol system, except for a few White Stars and one Charlan cruiser. Many in the Earth Force Command wanted Sheridan arrested and tried for treason and mutiny. Still, many others saw Sheridan as a hero, and they had the support of many in the political and civilian community. Sheridan did what no one else could or would do: fight and defeat Morgan Clark. After a long debate, and with some pressure from the other races, Sheridan was given the option to retire from the fleet with no restrictions on where he could go or live. However, before he would agree to this, he made several conditions of his own. The first condition was that every Earth ship, crew, and captain who joined him would receive total and complete amnesty for all actions taken during the war. All personnel would be allowed to continue their career in the military or retire with full benefit. The second one was that Mars would be granted its complete and unconditional independence from Earth with no harassment or restrictions. His final condition was more personal. After the victory of Clark's Shadow Omegas, Commander Susan Avonavo was gravely injured and was sent back to Babylon 5. During this time, a piece of alien technology was used to heal her fully and return her to duty. As a reward for her courage, loyalty, leadership, and friendship, Commander was promoted to full captain and given command of the Advanced Warlock-class destroyer EAS Titan for its one-year shakedown cruise. But there was also the task of finding and trying those who had committed war crimes during Clark's reign. While most of Clark's followers were killed, many remained in hiding. Those who were already in custody had their trials almost as soon as the war came to an end. For Captain Trevor Hall of the Heracles, after the Battle of Proxima, the ship was sent to Beta 9 for repairs, and Captain Hall was held under arrest until the war ended. When he faced a military tribunal for his actions, the charges were murder, terrorism, piracy, and cowardice in the face of the enemy. His only defense was that he was following orders. It only took about 2 hours for a guilty verdict, and he was demoted to the rank of lieutenant and sentenced to 50 years in prison. He committed suicide 7 months later. Heracles' executive officer, Commander Sandra Levitt, was then put on trial for her actions. She pleaded guilty to all charges, but a plea from Sheridan resulted in her being discharged from the service with limited benefits and generally left to her own devices. Commander Levitt would return to duty 6 years later to fight in the Drac War. Ironically, as the captain of a new EAS Pulak, she would be killed in combat several years later. President Sheridan would personally send a letter to her husband and children about her bravery and sacrifice. Captain Edward McDougan of the Vista would return to duty and serve as a task force commander during the Drac War. He would retire in 2286 as a full admiral and spend his remaining years as a guest speaker at the Earth Force Academy. He would pass away in 2291. Captain Jack Maynard of the A.S. Cortez was cleared of any wrongdoing, as all his actions were taken in the search and rescue of Earth ships and their crews. And since he never engaged in any combat missions, he and his crew were given the Earth Force Medal of Valor and returned to service. Many other Earth ships would be allowed to return to service once they were cleared of any wrongdoing. In some cases, Earth sent other ships to find them and bring them in under an offer of full amnesty. Most ships did return. In some instances, the vessel was renamed, and the crew was disbanded and reassigned to new positions, issued new service records, and allowed to continue their careers. A few ships remain unaccounted for, and efforts to locate them are ongoing. As for Night Watch, most of its personnel were investigated, and those who did not commit any serious crimes were quietly dismissed from service and forgotten. But by far, one of the most challenging issues was with the EAS Lysander, the ship that gave Earth its only victory. Captain Frank Regun used a false distress call to lure enemy ships into an ambush. Such tactics were considered illegal. However, since Captain Sheridan had done the same during the Minbari War and faced no consequences, it created a dilemma for the tribunal members. In the end, Captain Regun was cleared of any wrongdoing and reinstated to duty. But after learning that Sheridan would face no punishment for what many considered open treason, he resigned his commission and left to work for a private cargo company. Until he died in 2289, Regun still harbored a great disdain for Sheridan and his people. Following his resignation from the Earth Force, Sheridan held a press conference announcing the creation of the new Interstellar Alliance. This new government would be formed from all the major and most powerful races that had supported him during the Shadow and Earth Civil Wars. Sheridan would serve as the first president, with Minbari Ambassador Delenn, his new wife, as the vice president. This announcement came as a surprise to many in the Earth Dome. However, after assurances from other major races, which included the sharing of technology and resources, the Earth Alliance openly joined and has been a major supporter of the Interstellar Alliance since then. But even now, a significant threat to both the IA and Earth was lurking in the shadows, and soon would drag the Alliance into yet another bloody war. The creation of the Interstellar Alliance was first conceived shortly after the Shadow War. Captain Sheridan needed a way to unite the League of Non-Aligned Worlds, allowing them to rebuild safely and protecting them from threats like the Drak and Large Raider Group. However, the paranoia and self-centeredness of the leaders of these races made it nearly impossible to achieve this unity. Despite the trust he had fostered during the Shadow War, the leaders began to bicker among themselves once the conflict ended. Sheridan decided to use this distrust to his advantage. Following the Shadow War and during the Earth Civil War, Sheridan began sending White Stars on minor missions to Asteroid Field. He ordered them to fire on a few asteroids, then had Commander Susan Ivanova, who anchored the Babylon 5 propaganda broadcast, announce that nothing had occurred in those areas. The League would subsequently run around in a conspiracy-fueled frenzy trying to uncover what was happening. Eventually, they confronted Sheridan and demanded answers. When Sheridan tried to dismiss the incidents as mere rumors, their paranoia only intensified. In a weak attempt at a power play, the League insisted that the White Star Fleet be sent into the League of Non-Aligned Worlds to protect them from these mysterious events. In return, they promised to support any actions he took and would even accompany him if necessary. For Sheridan, this was a significant victory. By playing the role of a weak leader and allowing the League to believe they had achieved a considerable victory, he gained support from almost all the League races, as well as from the Centauri and Minbari, to back him in his fight against President Clark. In 2261, the Interstellar Alliance established as an official government, Sheridan could begin the process of rebuilding countless worlds devastated by ongoing wars and disasters. Sheridan would lead the Alliance from Babylon 5 until their new headquarters were constructed on Minbar. This move represented a sign of openness from the normally isolationist Minbari, serving as a beacon of hope and trust for the other races. At Sheridan's suggestion, Captain Elizabeth Loxley was appointed commander of Babylon 5, with the clear understanding that she would be in command and not Sheridan. During the Alliance's first year, they faced new challenges and enemies, including the Centauri War. The Drac, seeking revenge for Ambassador Londo Mollari's betrayal, forced the new Centauri leadership into numerous minor skirmishes with the League and even launched an attack on Babylon 5 itself. The war lasted only a few months, but it ended with the Narn and Drazi fleets attacking Centauri Prime, causing horrific damage and claiming hundreds of thousands of lives. Londo Mollari would become the new emperor and temporarily leave the Alliance to restore order to the Centauri Republic, but he returned shortly after his death when Emperor Vir Kodo ascended to the throne. The Alliance also made significant efforts to dismantle the local raider groups that had been terrorizing several of the weaker League races. Another brief conflict arose when a nomadic race attacked the station. This battle occurred just as the majority of the White Star Fleet was engaged in combat with a raider group. The struggle was fierce and costly, but the station held its ground, and the attackers retreated beyond Babylon 5's space. By the end of the first year, the Interstellar Alliance was beginning its move to Minbar, leaving the station in the hands of Earth Force. For the next 4 years, peace prevailed, but this tranquility was about to end. In 2267, the Interstellar Alliance was preparing to celebrate its 5th anniversary with much fanfare and excitement. At this time, almost all races were at peace, and the aftermath of the previous wars had been addressed. Commerce was rapidly growing across the economies of the member world. Centauri Prime had rejoined the Alliance, the Narn regime had successfully rebuilt its worlds, and the Minbari had abandoned entirely their isolationism to engage with the wider galaxy. One of the first projects President Sheridan approved was the creation of a new class of ship designed to lead the Alliance into the future. This class was known as the White Star-class destroyers. With the assistance of Michael Garibaldi, utilizing resources from Edgar's Industries, the new ships would be named ISA Victory. Excalibur would amalgamate Earth, Minbari, and Vorlon technologies into a single vessel. The project was kept secret, intended to be revealed during the anniversary event. Meanwhile, the alien race known as the Drac had been quietly gathering forces and were about to launch a significant attack on Earth using a shadow planet killer, commonly referred to as a death cloud. They plan to destroy Earth as an act of revenge, followed by attacks on Minbari, Centauri, and finally the Narn homeworlds. With the Alliance crippled, the Drac aimed to purge the population of every Alliance world and establish their empire from the ashes. When the technomage named Galen learned of this threat, he sent warnings to Sheridan and a few select individuals in hopes of thwarting the Drac. One of those contacted was Earth Force Captain Leonard Anderson of the ES Sharon. Upon recognizing the impending danger facing Earth, Sheridan and Anderson took the 2 prototype ships to investigate the recently destroyed planet, Daltron 7. Upon their arrival in the system, they encountered the main Drac fleet escorting the Death Cloud. After a brief skirmish, both vessels managed to escape and return to their respective bases on Earth. During the journey, Sheridan urged Captain Elizabeth Loxley, commander of Babylon 5, to sound the alarm and mobilize every available ship to defend the planet. When the 2 Victory-class ships arrived in the Sol system, they were met by several hundred Omega destroyers and vessels from other allied races, including Minbari, Narn, and members of the League. Moments later, the Drac Armada jumped in, with the Shadow Cloud following closely behind. Recognizing the threat posed by the planet killer, Sheridan ordered all ships to focus on it while leaving the Drac vessels to the planetary defense grid. In a climactic battle that resulted in hundreds of ships lost on both sides, the IS Victory sacrificed itself to destroy the Death Cloud. However, the Drac still had one final trick up their sleeve. In an act of malice, they released a bioweapon, dubbed the Drac Plague, into Earth's atmosphere. The planet was placed under total quarantine with orders to fire upon any ship attempting to enter or leave. After several weeks of study, it was discovered that the virus would require at least 5 years to adapt to humans before it became fatal. This was the only bright spot in an otherwise dire situation. Additionally, the Drac attacked and destroyed the shipyards where the Victory-class ships were built, making Excalibur a one-of-a-kind vessel. In a desperate effort to save Earth, the Interstellar Alliance converted Excalibur into a research vessel, granting it full and unrestricted access to the territories of all member races. Under the command of Captain Matthew Gideon, Excalibur would spend the next 2 years searching for a cure, eventually succeeding. During this time, the war with the Drac escalated as more Alliance ships were deployed to the front lines. Fighting the Drac was challenging since they were nomadic and lacked a real home world or territory, which made confrontations more about happenstance than proactive engagement. However, after nearly 12 years of brutal conflict, the Alliance dealt a devastating blow to the Drac. By tricking them into believing the Alliance had a central headquarters on an isolated world, the Drac sent their remaining fleet to attack it, only to arrive in an empty system with the system's sun about to go nova. The Drac fleet was annihilated, reducing their threat to only minor raids and small encounters. After over a decade of warfare, the Drac threat was finally eliminated. Now, the galaxy could begin to rebuild and resume its mission of peaceful exploration and trade. A discussion of Earth Alliance spacecraft cannot begin without a thorough understanding of the history of ship development. In the early days before World War III, space exploration was slow and expensive. Most nations involved in space were in competition with each other instead of acting in concert. The symbol of cooperation, the International Space Station, began to see less and less use as various nations, including the United States and its allies, the European Union, Russia, and China, began to construct their independent facilities. By the time the war arrived, each nation possessed a rudimentary set of fighting spacecraft, although these were little more than maneuverable satellites with crude lasers or missiles attached. The most sophisticated of these were operated by the United States in support of the Earth Shield project, which consisted of advanced communications satellites that also had highly accurate anti-missile lasers. Accurate fighting ships did not begin to appear until the period of radar activity that followed the first expansion into the solar system. The first recorded use of a weapon was a modified laser used by one prospector to defend a claim against another. Soon, pirates were using similar devices as standard equipment, and the Belters responded by installing not only laser guns but also the first external lighter linkages, employing simple one-person crafts based on the Alpha and Beta designs. These crude fighters were little more than frameworks built around a thruster and a pilot-aimed laser cannon or missile rack. Typically, these vessels had no armor or superstructure, and a pilot's life expectancy was only 2 or 3 sorties. Still, prospectors were willing to take the risk, considering the potential profits from valuable claims. At the same time, raiders figured they could make a lifetime fortune with just 1 or 2 successful attacks. As the raiders grew in power, 2 significant things happened. First, the Belt Alliance organized into a fighting force, producing the first armed freighters and guard carriers intended to protect small outposts and convoys. Then, in the 2120s, the Earth Force built its naval elements, spearheaded by the Orestes dreadnought, which existed solely to lead strikes on pirate strongholds. These expensive command ships were assisted by Tethys frigates, Ares destroyers, and London-class light combat vessels, which were short-range craft rather like large fighters. In the days before the Star Fury program, the Alliance operated the Raptor-class attack fighter, as well as Beta and Gamma light fighters, which the Belt Alliance designed initially. Also appearing were a variety of civilian freighter hulls, as well as the Earth Force One, the well-known presidential transport that later became a mobile symbol of the Earth Alliance. After the arrival of the Centauri, the Alliance began its first efforts to construct ships capable of interstellar travel. Existing hulls were improved to survive the rigors of hyperspace, and new designs started to emerge that were explicitly intended for use away from Sol. Of particular interest was the new exploration ship called the Oracle, named after a Greek legend involving a seer who could provide information to anyone who desired it. Other new ship designs included the Epimetheus command cruiser, which replaced the Crest in that role once that hull proved unsuitable for hyperspace missions. Also appearing were the Avenger, Earth's first dedicated carrier, known for its internal bays developed as part of the Star Fury program, the Hermes military transport capable of high-speed travel between systems, the Artemis, a more advanced frigate with better armor and weaponry than the existing Tethys, and the Orion, a ring-shaped starbase that could be constructed in highly modular sections. The first truly capable Prometheus defense satellites, armed with rapid-fire missile racks, also began to appear during this era. These new units operated weapons captured or purchased from alien races and then improved by Alliance scientists. These devices included missile racks, light particle beams, medium lasers, at that time referred to as heavy lasers, and the first interceptors. The years that followed saw the introduction of several new designs intended to support existing military vessels, not just operate alone. These included the Cotton-class tender, a mobile repair and resupply craft, as well as large bulk freighters or barges, and even the first Q-ship designs. The need for a ground invasion capability led to the development of the first assault vehicles capable of carrying troops to a target world. While these vehicles were capable enough, they did not exist in sufficient quantities to truly fulfill the mission at hand. The Galahad-class assault transport, along with its array of Bolt assault shuttles, could likely capture a single small installation or town, but would have no hope of actually invading and controlling a populated world. This lack of ground strength was one of the major contributors to the Alliance's unwillingness to take armed conflict into alien space, despite the opportunities presented by the Chlonus and Kolani, and later the Narn frontier. The final years of the 22nd century saw new improvements in weapons technologies. The Alliance finally perfected the interceptor and produced its first railgun, heavy plasma cannon, standard particle beams, and particle cannons. These advancements resulted in new models of the Aertus, Epimetheus, Orion, Crest, Artemis, Tethys, and Hermes, as well as the next generation of Star Fury, known as the Flying Fox. In addition, Delta fighters, the pinnacle of Delta advancement, made their appearance and rapidly entered widespread service, not only in the Earth and Belt alliances but also among raiders and even foreign powers. New support ships included the short-lived Tahiti Meat Collier, which was later supplanted by improvements to the Cotton Tender, and the Perseus Minesweeper, which, coupled with a suite of new captor mine designs, significantly improved the defenses at most major Earth Alliance installations. It was during the early decade of the 23rd century that the Earth Alliance first began to develop the strength that would be so sorely tested during the Dilger War. Several important hulls appeared for the first time, without which the Alliance would have had terrible difficulty defeating the Imperium. These ships included the Olympus corvette, actually a destroyer, the Hyperion heavy cruiser, the Nova dreadnought, the Condor long-range troop transport, and the Sagittarius missile cruiser, along with the vastly improved Star Fury known as the Tiger. Although few new weapons appeared during this period, advancements were made in missile technologies as well as engine, thruster, and reactor capabilities that vastly extended the range of older ships in the inventory. This resulted in new versions of the Tethys, Artemis, Oracle, and Crest. The latter vessel, long limited to only its home system, received a better engine suite that enabled travel through hyperspace at a tremendously ponderous rate. Rather than retire the class, the Crest was assigned the role of Monitor, a sort of pocket dreadnought intended only to defend fixed points. Meanwhile, the addition of the Hyperion and Olympus to the inventory allowed the Alliance to retire the aging fleet of Epimetheus and Aertus-class vessels finally. However, some examples of those classes continued to operate for years after they technically became obsolete. Similarly, the London Light Combat Vessel, which had the short range of a fighter but lacked the guns of a frigate, was finally shelved once the capable Tiger light cruiser came on the scene. The advert of the Dilger War saw the rapid creation of new versions of various ships, including the Olympus, the hotly contested Sagittarius Hyperion, the Thetis Condor, and Artemis. Not all of these designs were particularly effective. Wartime experimentation also led to the development of the Midway-class fast carrier, which traded lighter capability for speed and was quickly retired. The Valkyrie lighter, developed in competition with the recently created Star Fury, was introduced. This skillful craft quickly replaced the ponderous and poorly named Bull. Additionally, various military conversions of civilian units emerged, including advanced cargo ships, missile barges, and even the Dionysus mid-range base, which served as a logistical hub in occupied systems. Considering that the Earth Alliance was involved in the war for only a couple of years, the number of new ships, improved variants, and conversions is quite staggering. The decade that followed the war produced some of the most intense changes in the Earth Alliance Navy that had ever been seen. Just about every ship class in service, and indeed nearly every individual ship, underwent some form of retrofit to upgrade its capabilities and take advantage of new technologies. The Hyperion alone saw no less than 5 new variants appear during the decade following the war. The ships that benefited most from advancements were the Hyperion, Avenger, Orion, Nova, Olympus, Oracle, Artemis, Lethe, and Rests. The Aurora Star Fury also appeared quickly, pushing the existing Tiger and Nova designs into retirement. Several new ship designs were tested and prototyped, including the Kitty Hawk carrier, Valiant Minesweeper, Myrmidon light combat vessel, and several other civilian ship types. Most of these were considered failures, although the Myrmidon was adopted for use by several colonies for independent local defense. Mars, for example, intended to use these ships against Earth should a war of independence come to pass. The primary advancement that made all of this possible was the pulse cannon, which eventually appeared in 3 varieties. Light, mainly for anti-fighter work. Medium, for use as secondary firepower on cruiser and destroyer-class vessels. And heavy, to provide maximum flexibility on large gun emplacements. A blast from a heavy pulse cannon could knock virtually any heavy weapon off the side of an enemy cruiser or sweep away all but the heaviest fighters right out of space. Pulse cannons of all sizes began to appear on frontline combat elements as early as late 2130, making them one of the fastest weapons to transition from the drawing board to full-scale production. The Alliance also made a fortune selling examples of this weapon to neighboring races, particularly the Karens, who installed light pulse cannons on most of their ships within that same decade. The development of the pulse cannon came just a few years before the arrival of the Earth-Minbari War. Still, neither that weapon nor any of the other post-Dilger technologies were enough to stop the Federation's steady advancement into Earth space. After the war, Earth Force embarked on a crash program to develop new ships and weapons capable of stopping the Minbari should they choose to return. In addition to new variants of the Hyperion, Nova, Orestes, Orion, and Lethe, the Alliance also produced the highly effective Omega Destroyer and Poseidon Supercarrier, as well as Bellerophon heavy defense satellites and a 2-seat version of the Star Fury known as the Badger. Additionally, funds were allocated to produce the next generation of Earth units, including prototype Thunderbolt fighters that were coming online, and a mystery ship known only as the Warlock. Alongside the improvements made in the basic navy, other factions within the Alliance have also made advancements since the Minbari War. The Belt Alliance upgraded a number of their ships to new technologies, and Psi-Corps is known to have launched a few vessels for their use, including a mothership transport and even their fleet of Star Furies. Civilian craft include the well-known luxury liners seen traveling about the colonies, as well as corporate escort ships and independent pirate hunter designs. Upon joining the Interstellar Alliance, Earth gained access to new technologies, including artificial gravity and improved sensors. Earth Force also began reintroducing older weapons, such as railguns and laser pulse arrays, which had been retired due to their need for extensive maintenance. In addition, several new ship designs are now entering service as older classes are being retired from duty. For Earth, the future looks brighter than it has been in years. Only time will tell if they can truly reach for greatness.